Hello. I almost started talking without my microphone being on. Hello. Hi. Welcome to Storytime with Moog. I am Moog. Today we're reading Star Maker by Olaf Stapledon. We will be finishing. So we will be starting with chapter 11.3. I double checked this time. Chapter 11.3 and finishing for the rest of the book. Very exciting. Okay. I don't have any reading updates. I have not done any reading because I've been crocheting. Um, should we just do it? It is going to be a bit longer today. According to my Kindle, it says it is going to take 3 hours and 23 minutes. But we all know that that's a lie. One, because I'm reading out loud and I also pause, but two, because there might be notes at the end, so that could be misleading as well. So, do we remember what happened last time? Sort of. Okay, so now we are talking in this in the story. We are now talking more generally. Instead of focusing on individual worlds, we're saying wide sweeping commentary about planets and about humanoid species and the such. So I'm trying to think like the most succinct way to say it without going into like a long sprawling rant. Okay. So there have been there's been a lot of similarities in that things that happen on each of these planets are being repeated as evolution is happening, and people or the humanoid species are not really learning from them. There is also the very few planets who make it to a utopian world. Most of them die out before then, because of mostly because of their own downfall, because they're, you know, too far swinging into being reliant, or too far swinging into being too independent, or whatever the case is. There were several different examples that they said. But now we are talking about stars, and it seems that the stars are also sort of taking on human-like qualities, or we are reflecting human-like qualities on the stars, and that they're reaching out to planets with their little star arms and like devouring planets themselves. Sort of. Terrible. Okay. Chapter 11.3. Let's just do it. Stars. Stars are best regarded as living organisms, but organisms which are physiologically and psychologically of a very peculiar kind. The outer and middle layers of a mature star apparently consist of tissues woven of currents of incandescent gases. These gaseous tissues live and maintain the stellar consciousness by intercepting part of the immense flood of energy that wells from the congested and furiously active interior of the star. The innermost of the vital layers must be a kind of digestive apparatus which transmutes the crude radiation into forms required for the maintenance of the star's life. Outside this digestive area lies some sort of coordinating layer, which may be thought of as the star's brain. The outermost layer, including the corona, respond to the excessively faint stimuli on the star's cosmical environment, to light from neighboring stars, to cosmic rays, to the impact of meteors, to tidal stresses caused by the gravitational influence of planets or of other stars. These influences could not, of course, produce any clear impression but for a strange tissue of gaseous sense organs, which discriminate between them in respective and quality and direction, and transmit information to the correlating brain layer. The sense experience of a star, though so foreign to us, proved, after all, fairly intelligible. It was not excessively difficult for us to enter telepathically into the star's perception of the gentle titillations, strokings, pluckings, and scintillations that came to it from the galactic environment. It was strange that, though the star's own body was actually in a state of extreme brilliance, none of this outward flowing light took effect upon its sense organs. Only the faint incoming light of other stars was seen. This afforded the perception of a surrounding heaven of flashing constellations, which were set not in blackness, but in blackness tinged with the humanly inconceivable color of the cosmic rays. The stars themselves were seen colored according to their styles and age. But though the sense perception of the stars was fairly intelligible to us, the motor side of stellar life was, at first, quite incomprehensible. We had to accustom ourselves to an entirely new way of regarding physical events, for the normal voluntary motor activity of a star's appearance to be no other than the star's normal physical movement studied by our science, movement in relation to other stars and the galaxy as a whole. A star must be thought of as vaguely aware of the gravitational influence of the whole galaxy, and more precisely aware of the pull of its near neighbors, though of course their influence would generally be far too slight to be detected by human instruments. To these influences the star responds by voluntary movement, which to the astronomers of the little-minded worlds seems purely mechanical. But the star itself unquestioningly and rightly feels this movement to be the freely willed expression of its own psychological nature. Such, at least, was the almost incredible conclusion forced on us by the research carried out by the Galactic Society of Worlds. Thus, the normal experience of a star appears to consist in perception of its cosmical environment, along with continuous voluntary changes within its own body and in its position in relation to other stars. This change of position consists, of course, in rotation and passage. The star's motor life is thus to be thought of almost as a life of dance or of figure skating, executed with perfect skill according to an ideal principle which emerges into consciousness from the depths of the stellar nature and becomes clearer as the star's mind matures. This ideal principle cannot be conceived by men save as it is manifested in practice, as the well-known physical principle of least action, or the pursuit of that course which in all the gravitational and other conditions is the least extravagant. The star itself, by means of its purchase on the electromagnetic field of the cosmos, apparently wills and executes this ideal course with all the attention and delicacy of response which a motorist exercises in threading his way through traffic on a winding road, or a ballet dancer in performing the most intricate movements with the greatest economy of effort. Almost certainly, the star's whole physical behavior is normally experienced as a blissful, an ecstatic, in ever-successful pursuit of formal beauty. This the minded worlds were able to discover through their own most formalistic aesthetic experience. In fact, it was through this experience that they first made contact with stellar minds. But the actual perception of the aesthetic or religious rightness of the mysterious canon which the stars so earnestly accepted remained far beyond the mental range of the minded worlds. they had to take, so to speak, on trust. Clearly, this aesthetic canon was in some way symbolic of some spiritual intuition that remained occult to the minded worlds. The life of the individual star is not only a life of physical movement, it is also undoubtedly in some sense a cultural and a spiritual life. In some manner, each star is aware of its fellow stars as conscious beings. This mutual awareness is probably intuitive and telepathic, though presumably it is also constantly supported by inference from observation of the behavior of others. From the psychological relations of stars, of star with star, sprang a whole world of social experiences, which were so alien to the minded worlds that almost nothing can be said of them. There is perhaps some reason for believing that the free behavior of the individual star is determined not only by the austere canons of the dance, but also by the social will to cooperate with others. Certainly, the relation between stars is perfectly social. It reminded me of the relation between the performers in an orchestra, but an orchestra composed of persons wholly intent on the common task. Possibly, but not certainly, each star, executing its particular theme, is moved not only by the pure aesthetic or religious motive, but also by a will to afford its partners every legitimate opportunity for self-expression. If so, the life of each star is experienced not only as the perfect execution of formal beauty, but also as the perfect expression of love. It would, however, be unwise to attribute affection and comradeship to the stars in any human sense. The most that can safely be said is that it would probably be more false to deny them affection for one another than to assert that they were, indeed, capable to love. Telepathic research suggested that the experience of the stars was through and through of a different texture from that of the minded worlds. Even to attribute to them thought or desire of any kind is probably grossly anthropomorphic, but it is impossible to speak of their experience in any other terms. The mental life of a star is almost certainly a progress from an obscure infantile mentality to the discriminate consciousness of maturity. All stars, young and old, are mentally angelic, in that they all freely and joyfully will the good will, the pattern of right action so far as it is revealed to them. But the great tenuous young stars, though they perfectly execute their part in the galactic dance, would seem to be in some manner spiritually naive or childlike in comparison with their more experienced elders. Thus, though there is normally no such thing as sin among the stars, no deliberate choice of the course known to be wrong for the sake of some end known to be irrelevant, there is ignorance and consequent aberration from the pattern of the ideal as revealed to stars of somewhat mature mentality. But this aberration on the part of the young is itself apparently accepted by the most awakened class of the star as itself a desirable factor in the dance party. The dance pattern of the galaxy. I just wanted it to be a dance party in the galaxy. Just stars having a dance party, that's all I want. From the point of view of natural science, as known to the minded worlds, the behavior of young stars is, of course, always an exact expression of their youthful nature, and the behavior of the elder stars an expression of their nature. Galaxy dance party. Heck yeah. But, most surprisingly, the physical nature of a star at any stage of its growth is, in part, an expression of the telepathic influence of other stars. This fact can never be detected by the pure physics of any epoch. Unwittingly, scientists derive the inductive physical laws of stellar evolution from data, which are themselves an expression not only of normal physical influences, but also of the unsuspected psychical influence of star on star. In early ages of the cosmos, the first generation of stars had been obliged to find their way unhelped from infancy to maturity, but later generations were in some manner guided by the experience of their elders, so that they should pass more quickly and more thoroughly from the obscure to the fully lucid consciousness of themselves as spirits, and of the spiritual universe in which they dwelt. Almost certainly, the latest stars, to condense out of the primeval nebula, advanced, or will advance, more rapidly than their elders had done, and throughout the stellar host it was believed that in due season the youngest stars, when they had attained maturity, would pass far beyond the loftiest spiritual insight of their seniors. There is good reason to say that the two overmastering desires of all stars are the desire to execute perfectly their part in the communal dance, and the desire to press forward to the attainment of full insight into the nature of the cosmos. The latter desire was the factor in stellar mentality which was most comprehensible to the minded worlds. The climax of a star's life occurs when it has passed through the long period of its youth, during which it is what human astronomers call a red giant. At the close of this period, it shrinks rapidly into the dwarf state in which our sun now is. This physical cataclysm seems to be accompanied by far-reaching mental changes. Henceforth, though the star plays a less dashing part in the dance rhythms of the galaxy, it is perhaps more clearly and penetratingly conscious. It is interested less in the ritual of the stellar dance, more in its supposed spiritual significance. After this very long phase of physical maturity, there comes another crisis. The star shrinks into the minute and inconceivably dense condition in which our astronomers call it a white dwarf. Its mentality in the actual crisis proved almost impervious to the research of the minded worlds. It appeared to be a crisis of despair and of reoriented hope. Henceforth, the stellar mind presents increasingly a strain of baffling and even terrifying negativity, an icy and almost cynical aloofness, which, we suspected, was but the obverse of some dread rapture hidden from us. However that may be, the aged star still continues meticulously to fulfill its part in the dance, but its mood is deeply changed. The aesthetic fervors of youth, the more serene but earnest will of maturity, all maturity's devotion to the active pursuit of wisdom, now fall away. Perhaps the star is henceforth content with its achievement, such as it is, and pleased simply to enjoy the surrounding universe with such detachment and insight as it has attained. Perhaps, but the minded worlds were never able to ascertain whether the aged stellar mind eluded their comprehension through sheer superiority of achievement or through some obscure disorder of the spirit. In this state of old age, a star remains for a very long period, gradually losing energy and mentally withdrawing into itself, until it sinks into an impenetrable trance of senility. Finally, its light is extinguished and its tissues disintegrates into death. Henceforth, it continues to sweep through space, but it does so unconsciously and in a manner repugnant to its still conscious fellows. Such, very roughly stated, would seem to be the normal life of the average star. But there are many varieties within the general type, for stars vary in original size and in composition, and probably in psychological impact upon their neighbors. One of the commonest of the eccentric types is the double star, two mighty globes of fire waltzing through space together, in some cases almost in contact. Like all stellar relations, these partnerships are perfect, are angelic. Yet it is impossible to be certain whether the members experience anything which could properly be called a sentiment of personal love, or whether they regard one another solely as partners in a common task. Research undoubtedly suggested that the two beings did indeed move on their winding courses in some kind of mutual delight, and delight of close cooperation in the measures of the galaxy. But love? It is impossible to say. In due season, with the loss of momentum, the two stars come into actual contact. Then, seemingly in an agonizing blaze of joy and pain, they merge. After a period of unconsciousness, the great new star generates new living tissues and takes its place among the angelic company. The strange Cepheid variables proved the most baffling of all the stellar kinds. It seems that these and other variables of much longer period alternate mentally between fervor and quietism, in harmony with their physical rhythm. More than this, it is impossible to say. One event, which happens only to a small minority of the stars in the course of their dance life, is apparently of great psychological importance. This is the close approach of two or perhaps three stars to one another, and the consequent projection of a filament from one toward another. In the moment of this moth kiss, before the disintegration of the filament and the birth of planets, each star probably experiences an intense but humanly unintelligible physical ecstasy. Apparently, the stars which have been through this experience are supposed to have acquired a rather peculiar vivid apprehension of the unity of body and spirit. The virgin stars, however, though unblessed by this wonderful adventure, seem to have no desire to infringe the sacred canons of the dance in order to contrive opportunities for such encounters. Each one of them is angelically content to play its allotted part, and to observe the ecstasy of those that fate has favored. To describe the mentality of stars is, of course, to describe the unintelligible by means of intelligible but falsifying human metaphors. This tendency is particularly serious in telling of the dramatic relations between the stars and the minded worlds. For under the stress of these relations, the stars seem to have experienced, for the first time, emotions superficially like human emotions. So long as the stellar community was immune from interference by the minded worlds, every member of it behaved with perfect rectitude and had perfect bliss in the perfect expression of its own nature and of the common spirit. Even senility and death were accepted with calm, for they were universally seen to be involved in the pattern of existence, and what every star desired was not immortality, whether for itself or for the community, but the perfect fruition of stellar nature. But when at last the minded worlds, the planets, began to interfere appreciably with stellar energy and motion, a new and terrible and incomprehensible thing presumably entered into the experiences of the stars. The stricken ones found themselves caught in a distracting mental conflict. Through some cause which they themselves could not detect, they not merely erred, but willed to err. In fact, they sinned. Even while they still adored the right, they chose the wrong. I said that the trouble was unprecedented. This is not strictly true. Something not wholly unlike this public shame seems to have occurred in the private experience of nearly every star. But each sufferer succeeded in keeping his shame secret until either with familiarity it became tolerable, or else its source was overcome. It was indeed surprising that beings whose nature was in many ways so alien and so unintelligible should be in this one respect at least so startlingly human. In the outer layers of young stars, life nearly always appears not only in the normal manner, but also in the form of parasites, minute independent organisms of fire, often no bigger than a cloud in the terrestrial air, but sometimes as large as the earth itself. These salamanders either feed upon the welling energies of the star in the same manner as the star's own organic tissues feed, or simply prey upon those tissues themselves. Here, as elsewhere, the laws of biological evolution come into force, and in time there may appear races of intelligent, flame-like beings. Even when the salamandrian life does not reach this level, its effect on the star's tissue may become evident to the star as a disease of its skin and sense organs, or even of its deeper tissues. It then experiences emotions not wholly unlike human fright and shame, and anxiously and most humanly guards its secret from the telepathic reach of its fellows. The salamandrian races have never been able to gain mastery over their fiery worlds. Many of them succumb, soon or late, either to some natural disaster or to internecine life, or to the self-cleansing activities of their mighty host. Many others survive, but in a relatively harmless state, troubling their stars only with a mild irritation and a faint shade of insincerity in all their dealings with one another. In the public culture of the stars, the salamandrian pests was completely ignored. Each star believed itself to be the only sufferer and the only sinner in the galaxy. One indirect effect the pest did have on stellar thought. It introduced the idea of purity. Each star prized the perfection of the stellar community all the more by reason of its own secret experience of impurity. When the minded planets began to tamper seriously with stellar energy and stellar orbits, the effect was not a private shame, but a public scandal. It was patent to all observers that the culprit had violated the canons of the dance. The first aberrations were greeted with bewilderment and horror. Amongst the hosts of the virgin stars it was whispered that if the result of the much-prized interstellar contacts, whence the natural planets had sprung, was in the end this shameful irregularity, probably the original experience itself had also been sinful. The erring stars protested that they were not sinners, but victims of some unknown influence from the grains which revolved about them. Yet secretly they doubted themselves. Had they long ago, in the ecstatic sweep of star to star, after all infringed the canon of the dance? They suspected, moreover, that in respect of the irregularities which were now creating this public scandal, they could, if they had willed firmly enough, have contained themselves and preserved their true courses in spite of the irritants that had affected them. Meanwhile, the power of the minded planets increased. Suns were boldly steered to suit the purposes of their parasites. To the stellar population, it seemed, of course, that these erring stars were dangerous lunatics. The crisis came, as I have already said, when the worlds projected their first messenger toward the neighboring galaxy. The hurtling star, terrified at its own maniac behavior, took the only retaliation that was known to it. It exploded into the nova state and successfully destroyed its planets. From the orthodox stellar point of view, this act was a deadly sin, for it was an impious interference with the divinely appointed order of a star's life. But it secured the desired end and was soon copied by other desperate stars. Then followed that age of horror which I have already described from the point of view of the Society of Worlds. From the stellar point of view, it was no less terrible, for the condition of the stellar society soon became desperate. Gone was the perfection and beatitude of former days. The city of God had disintegrated into a place of hatred, recrimination, and despair. Hosts of the younger stars had become premature and embittered dwarves, while the elders had mostly grown senile. The dance pattern had fallen into chaos. The old passion for the canons of the dance remained, but the conception of the canons was obscured. Spiritual life had succumbed to the necessity of urgent action. The passion for the progress of insight into the nature of the cosmos also remained, but insight itself was obscured. Moreover, the former naive confidence, common to young and mature alike, the certainty that the cosmos was perfect and that the power behind it was righteous, had given place to blank despair. And that's the end of part 3. Okay, so in this one, we got the life cycle of a star. Very clearly. Thank you, Stapledon. We also have interactions with other stars, and it is stated in this, the experiences are written from a very human perspective, and it's hard to write the star's experience from the star's perspective because it is unknown, which totally makes sense. And then we also have commentary about how the star is just accepting the life cycle, that sort of thing. They're not wanting to live any longer or do anything different. They're a star. This is what they do. And that stellar travel has sort of changed that as well. And then also, the vermin is mentioned, and they're parasites, and they are like chipping away at the star, basically, instead of just like leaving the star alone to like do what it does. Yeah. Okay. Chapter 11, Part 4. Galactic Symbiosis. Such was the state of affairs when the minded worlds first attempted to make telepathic contact with the minded stars. I need not tell the stages by which mere contact was developed into a clumsy and precarious kind of communication. In time, the stars must have begun to realize that they were at grips, not with mere physical forces, nor yet with fiends, but with beings whose nature, though so profoundly alien, was at bottom identical with their own. Our telepathic research obscurely sensed the amazement which spread throughout the stellar populations. 2 opinions, 2 policies, 2 parties seem to have gradually emerged. One of these parties was convinced that the pretensions of the minded planets must be false, that beings whose history was compact of sin and strife and slaughter must be essentially diabolic, and that to parley with them was to court disaster. This party, at first in a majority, urged that the war should be continued till every planet had been destroyed. The minority party clamored for peace. The planets, they affirmed, were seeking in their own way the very same goal as the stars. It was even suggested that these minute beings, with their more varied experience and their long acquaintance with evil, might have certain kinds of insight which the stars, those fallen angels, lacked. Might not the two sorts of being create together a glorious symbiotic society and achieve together the end that was most dear to both, namely, the full awakening of the spirit? It was a long while before the majority would listen to this counsel. Destruction continued. The precarious energies of the galaxy were squandered. System after system of worlds was destroyed. Star after star sank into exhaustion and stupor. Meanwhile, the Society of Worlds maintained a pacific attitude. No more stellar energy was tapped. No more stellar orbits were altered. No stars were artificially exploded. Stellar opinion began to change. The crusade of extermination relaxed and was abandoned. There followed a period of isolationism in which the stars, intent on repairing their shattered society, left their former enemies alone. Gradually, a fumbling attempt to fraternization began between the planets and their suns. The two kinds of beings, though so alien that they could not at all comprehend each other's idiosyncrasies, were too lucid for mere tribal passions. They resolved to overcome all obstacles and enter into some kind of community. Soon it was the desire of every star to be girdled with artificial planets and enter into some sort of psychic partnership with its encircling companions, for it was by now clear to the stars that the vermin had much to give them. The experience of the two orders of beings was in many ways complementary. The stars retained still the tenor of the angelic wisdom of their golden age. The planets excelled in the analytic, the microscopic, and in that charity which was bred in them by knowledge of their own weak and suffering forebears. To the stars, moreover, it was perplexing that their minute companions could accept not merely this resignation but with joy a cosmos which evidently was seamed with evil. In due season, a symbiotic society of stars and planetary systems embraced the whole galaxy, but it was at first a wounded society, and ever after an impoverished galaxy. Few only of its million stars were still in their prime. Every possible sun was now girdled with planets. Many dead stars were stimulated to disintegrate their atoms so as to provide artificial suns. Others were used in a more economical manner. Special races of intelligent organisms were bred or synthesized to inhabit the surfaces of these great worlds. Very soon, upon 1,000 stars that once had blazed, teeming populations of innumerable types maintained an austere civilization. These subsided on the volcanic energies of their huge worlds. Minute, artificially contrived worm-like creatures, they crept laboriously over the plains where oppressive gravitation allowed not so much as a stone to project above the general level. So violent, indeed, was gravitation, that even the little bodies of these worms might be shattered by a fall of half an inch. Save for artificial lighting, the inhabitants of the stellar world lived in eternal darkness, mitigated only by the starlight, the glow of volcanic eruption, and the phosphorescence of their own bodies. This subterranean borings led down to the vast photosynthesis stations which converted the star's imprisoned energy for the uses of life and of mind. Intelligence in these gigantic worlds was, of course, a function not of the separate individual, but of the minded swarm. Like the insectoids, these little creatures, when isolated from the swarm, were mere instinctive animals, actuated wholly by the gregarious craving to return to the swarm. The need to people the dead stars would not have arisen had not the war reduced the number of minded planets and the number of suns available for new planetary systems dangerously near the minimum required to maintain the communal life in full diversity. The Society of Worlds had been delicately organized unity in which each element had a special function. It was therefore necessary, since the lost members could not be repeated, to produce new worlds to function in their places, at least approximately. Gradually, the symbiotic society overcame the immense difficulties of reorganization and began to turn its attention to the pursuit of that purpose which is the ultimate purpose of all awakened minds, the aim which they inevitably and gladly espouse because it is involved in their deepest nature. Henceforth, the symbiotic society gave all its best attention to the further awakening of the spirit. But this purpose, which formerly the angelic company of the stars and the ambitious society of worlds had each hoped to accompany in relation not merely to the galaxy, but to the cosmos, was now regarded more humbly. Both stars and worlds recognized that not merely the home galaxy, but the cosmical swarm of galaxies was nearing its end. Physical energy, once a seemingly inexhaustible fund, was becoming less and less available for the maintenance of life. It was spreading itself more and more evenly over the whole cosmos. Only here and there, and with difficulty, could the minded organisms intercept in its collapse from high to low potential. Very soon the universe would be physically senile. All ambitious plans had, therefore, to be abandoned. No longer was there any question of physical travel between the galaxies. Such enterprises would use up too many of the pence out of the few pounds of wealth that survived after the extravagance of former eons. No longer was there any unnecessary coming and going, even within the galaxy itself. The worlds clung to their suns, the suns steadily cooled, and as they cooled, the encircling worlds contracted their orbits for warmth's sake. But though the galaxy was physically impoverished, it was in many ways utopian. The symbiotic society of stars and worlds was perfectly harmonious. Strife between the two kinds was a memory of the remote past. Both were wholly loyal to the common purpose. They lived their personal lives in zestful cooperation, friendly conflict, and mutual interest. Each took part according to its capacity in the common task of cosmical exploration and appreciation. The stars were now dying off more rapidly than before, for the great host of the mature had become a great host of aged white dwarfs. As they died, they bequeathed their bodies to the service of the society, to be used either as reservoirs of subatomic energy, or as artificial suns, or as worlds to be peopled by intelligent populations of worms. Many a planetary system was now centered round an artificial sun. Physically, the substitution was tolerable, but beings that had become mentally dependent on partnership with a living star regarded a mere furnace with despondency. Foreseeing the inevitable dissolution of the symbiosis throughout the galaxy, the planets were now doing all in their power to absorb the angelic wisdom of the stars. But after very few eons, the planets themselves had to begin reducing their number. The myriad worlds could no longer all crowd closely enough around their cooling suns. Soon, the mental power of the galaxy, which had hitherto been with difficulty maintained at its highest pitch, must inevitably begin to wane. Yet the temper of the galaxy was not sad, but joyful. The symbiosis had greatly improved the art of telepathic communication, and now at last the many kinds of spirit which composed the galactic society were bound so closely in mutual insight that there had emerged out of their harmonious diversity a true galactic mind, whose mental reach surpassed that of the stars and of the worlds as far as these surpassed their own individuals. The galactic mind, which was but the mind of each individual star and world and minute organism in the worlds, enriched by all its fellows and awakened to finer recipients, saw that it had but a short time to live. Looking back through the ages of galactic history, down temporal vistas crowded with teeming and diversified populations, the mind of our galaxy saw that itself was the issue of untold strife and grief and hope frustrated. It confronted all the tortured spirits of the past not with pity or regret, but with smiling content, such as a man may feel toward his own childhood's tribulations. And it said, within the mind of each one of its members, their suffering, which to them seemed barren evil, was the little price to be paid for my future coming. Right and sweet and beautiful is the whole in which these things happen. For I am the heaven in which all my myriad progenitors find recompense, finding their heart's desire. For in the little time that is left me, I shall press on, with all my peers throughout the cosmos, to crown the cosmos with perfect and joyful insight, and to salute the maker of galaxies and stars and worlds with fitting praise. And that is the end of chapter 11. Some of these chapters are like super, super long. Like that one was altogether over an hour, like an hour and a half, I think. And then this next one is less than 10 minutes. We're getting a range of chapters. Chapter 12. A Stunted Cosmical Spirit. When at last our galaxy was able to make a full telepathic exploration of the cosmos of galaxies, it discovered that the state of life in the cosmos was precarious. Very few of the galaxies were now in their youth. Most were already far past their prime. Throughout the cosmos, the dead and lightless stars far outnumbered the living and luminous. In many galaxies, the strife of stars and worlds had been even more disastrous than in our own. Not gonna lie, I find it difficult not being able to see how much of the book is left. You can't tell? Look, here, I'll show you. This much. I know. We're 80% or 79, excuse me, we're 79% of the way through. Peace had been secured only after both parts had degenerated past hope of recovery. In most of the younger galaxies, however, this strife had not yet appeared, and efforts were already being made by the most awakened galactic spirits to enlighten the ignorant stellar and planetary societies about one another before they should blunder into conflict. The communal spirit of our galaxy now joined the little company of the most awakened beings of the cosmos, the scattered band of advanced galactic spirits, whose aim it was to create a real cosmical community with a single mind, the communal spirit of its myriad and diverse worlds and individual intelligences. Thus, it was hoped to acquire powers of insight and of creativity impossible on the merely galactic plane. With grave joy, we, the cosmical explorers who were already gathered up into communal mind of our own galaxy, now found ourselves in intimate union with a score of other galactic minds. We, or rather I, now experienced the slow drift of the galaxies much as a man feels the swing of his own limbs. From my score of viewpoints, I observed the great snowstorm of many million galaxies, streaming and circling, and ever withdrawing farther apart from one another with the relentless expansion of space. But though the vastness of space was increasing in relation to the size of galaxies and stars and worlds, to me, with my composite scattered body, space seemed no bigger than a great vaulted hall. My experience of time also had changed, for now, as on an earlier occasion, the eons had become for me as brief as minutes. I conceived the whole life of the cosmos not as an immensely protracted and leisurely passage from a remote and shadowy source to a glorious and a still more remote eternity, but as a brief, a headlong and forlorn race against galloping time. Confronted by the many backward galaxies, I seemed to myself to be a lonely intelligence in a wilderness of barbarians and beasts. The mystery, the futility, the horror of existence now bore down upon me most cruelly. For to me, to the spirit of that little band of awakened galaxies, surrounded by unawakened and doomed hordes in the last days of the cosmos, there appeared no hope of any triumph elsewhere. For me, the whole extent, seemingly, of existence was revealed. There could be no elsewhere. I knew with exactness the sum of cosmical matter, and through the expansion of space was already sweeping most of the galaxies apart more swiftly than light could bridge the gulf. Telepathic exploration still kept me in touch with the whole extent of the cosmos. Many of my own members were physically divided from one another by the insurmountable gulf created by the ceaseless expansion, but telepathically, they were still united. I, the communal mind of a score of galaxies, seemed now to myself to be the abortive and crippled mind of the cosmos itself. The myriad-fold community that supported me ought surely to have expanded to embrace the whole of existence. In the climax of cosmical history, the fully awakened mind of the cosmos ought surely to have won through to the fullness of knowledge and of worship. But this was not to be. For even now, in the late phase of the cosmos, when the physical potency was almost all exhausted, I had reached only to a lowly state of spiritual growth. I was mentally still adolescent, yet my cosmical body was already in decay. I was the struggling embryo of the cosmical egg, and the yolk was already in decay. Looking back along the vistas of the eons, I was impressed less by the length of the journey that had led me to my present state than by its haste and confusion, and even its brevity. peering into the very earliest of the ages, before the stars were born, before the nebulae were formed from chaos. I still failed to see any clear source, but only a mystery as obscure as any that confronts the little inhabitants of the earth. Equally, when I tried to probe the depths of my own being, I found impenetrable mystery. Though my self-consciousness was awakened to a degree thrice removed beyond the self-consciousness of human beings, namely from the simple individual to the world mind, and from the world mind to the galactic mind, and thence to the abortively cosmical, yet the depth of my nature was obscure. Although my mind now gathered into itself all the wisdom of all worlds in all ages, and though the life of my cosmical body was itself the life of myriads of infinitely diverse worlds and myriads of infinitely diverse individual creatures, and though the texture of my daily life was one of joyful and creative enterprise, yet all this was as nothing. For around lay the host of the unfulfilled galaxies, and my own flesh was already grievously impoverished by the death of my stars, and the eons were slipping past with fatal speed. Soon the texture of my cosmical brain must disintegrate, and then inevitably I must fall away from my prized, though imperfect, state of lucidity, and descend through all the stages of the mind's second childhood, down to the cosmical death. It was very strange that I, who knew the whole extent of space and time, and counted the wandering stars like sheep, overlooking none, that I, who was the most awakened of all beings, I, the glory which myriads in all ages had given their lives to establish and myriads had worshipped, should now look about me with the same overpowering awe, the same abashed and tongue-tied worship as that which human travelers in the desert feel under the stars. End of chapter 12. I told you it was a short one. The writing style is really nice. And the ideas, like, it seems almost like a lot of this is like thought experiment, you know what I mean? Like there's a lot of discussion I feel like could be happening around this if you have the right group of people who are willing to discuss this very, very nerdy book, I feel. Yes. You took the emotes right out of my mouth. All right. Chapter 13. Oops. This book is a trip. It really is. Yeah, definitely. I was thinking that as well. Anytime we are like flying through space or like we're trying to analyze something, it is pretty out there. Oopsie. There we go. Jeez. It's clearly too much for me to handle. Just throwing things everywhere. All right. Chapter 13. The beginning and the end. Part 1. Back to the nebulae. While the awakened galaxies were striving to make full use of the last phase of their lucid consciousness, while I, the imperfect cosmical mind, was thus striving, I began to have a strange, new experience. I seemed to be telepathically stumbling upon some being or beings of an order that was at first quite incomprehensible to me. At first, I supposed that I had inadvertently come into touch with subhuman beings in the primitive age of some natural planet, perhaps with some lowly amoeboid microorganism floating in a primeval sea. I was aware only of the crude hungers of the body, such as the lust to assimilate physical energy for the maintenance of life, the lust of movement and of contact, the lust of light and warmth. Patiently, I tried to dismiss this trivial irrelevance, but it continued to haunt me, becoming more intrusive and more lucid. Gradually, it took on such an intensity of physical vigor and well-being, and such a divine confidence as was manifested by no spirits up and down the ages since the stars began. I need not tell of the stages by which I learned at last the meaning of this experience. Gradually, I discovered that I made contact not with microorganisms, nor yet with worlds or stars or galactic minds, but with the minds of the great nebulae before their substance had disintegrated into stars to form the galaxies. Presently, I was able to follow their history from the time when they first awakened, when they first existed to discrete clouds of gas flying apart from after. We're going to start that sentence over. Too many mishaps in that one. Presently, I was able to follow their history from the time when they first awakened, when they first existed as discrete clouds of gas, flying apart after the explosive act of creation, even to the time when, with the birth of the stellar hosts out of their substance, they sank into senility and death. In their earliest phase, when physically they were the most tenuous clouds, their mentality was no more than a formless craving for action and a sleepy perception of the infinitely slight congestion of their own vacuous substance. I watched them condense into close-knit balls with sharper contours, then into lentoid discs, featured with brighter streams and darker chasms. As they condensed, each gained more unity, became more organic in structure. Congestion, though so slight, brought greater mutual influence into their atoms, which still were no more closely packed in relation to their size than stars in space. Each nebula was now a single great pool of faint radiation, a single system of all pervasive waves spreading from atom to atom. So many words I don't know. It's very wordy and very specific in the word choices. Yes, agreed. And now, mentally, these greatest of all megatheria, these amoeboid titans, began to waken into a vague unity of experience. By human standards, and even by the standards of the minded worlds and the stars, the experience of the nebulae was incredibly slow-moving. For owing to their prodigious size and the slow passage of the undulations to which their consciousness was physically related, 1,000 years was for them an imperceptible instant. Periods such as men call geological, containing the rise and fall of species after species, they experienced as we experience the hours. Each of the great nebulae was aware of its own lentoid body as a single volume compact of tingling currents. Each craved fulfillment of its organic potency, craved easement from the pressure of physical energy welling softly within it, craved at the same time free expression of all its powers of movement, craved also something more. For though, both in physique and mentality, these primordial beings were strangely like the primeval, microorganisms of planetary life, they were also remarkably different, or at least they manifested a character which even I, the rudimentary cosmical mind, had overlooked in microorganisms. This was a will or predilection that I can only, by halting metaphor, suggest. Though even at their best, these creatures were physically and intellectually very simple. They were gifted with something which I am forced to describe as a primitive but intense religious consciousness, for they were ruled by two longings, both of which were essentially religious. They desired, or rather they had a blind urge toward union with one another, and they had a blind, passionate urge to be gathered up once more into the source whence they had come. The universe that they inhabited was, of course, a very simple, even a poverty-stricken universe. It was also to them quite small. For each of them, the cosmos consisted of two things: the nebula's own almost featureless body, and the bodies of the other nebulae. In this early age of the cosmos, the nebulae were very close to one another, for the volume of the cosmos was at this time small in relation to its parts, whether nebulae or electrons. In that age, the nebulae, which in man's day are like birds at large in the sky, were confined, as it were, within a narrow aviary. Thus, each exercised an appreciable influence on its fellows, and as each became more organized, more of a coherent physical unity, it distinguished more readily between its native wave pattern and the irregularities which its neighbor's influence imposed upon that pattern. And by a native propensity implanted on it at the time of its emergence from the common ancestral cloud, it interpreted this influence to mean the presence of other-minded nebulae. Thus, the nebulae in their prime were vaguely but intensely aware of one another as distinct beings. They were aware of one another, but their communication with each other was very meager and very slow. As prisoners confined in separate cells give one another a sense of companionship by tapping on their cell walls, and may even in time work out a crude system of symbols, so the nebulae revealed to one another their kinship by exercising gravitational stress upon one another, and by long drawn-out pulsations of their light. Even in the early phase of their existence, when the nebulae were very close to one another, a message would take many thousands of years to spell itself out from beginning to end, and many millions of years to reach its destination. When the nebulae were at their prime, the whole cosmos reverberated with their talk. In the earliest phase of all, when these huge creatures were still very close to one another and also immature, their parleying was concerned wholly with the effort to reveal themselves to one another. With childlike glee, they laboriously communicated their joy in life, their hungers and pains, their whims, their idiosyncrasies, their common passion to be once more united, and to be, as men have sometimes said, at one in God. But even in early days, when few nebulae were yet mature, and most were still very unclear in their minds, it became evident to the more awakened that, far from uniting, they were steadily drifting apart. As the physical influence of one of another diminished, each nebula perceived its companions shrinking into the distance. Messages took longer and longer to elicit answers. Had the nebulae been able to communicate telepathically, the expansion of the universe might have been faced without despair. But these beings were apparently too simple to make direct and lucid mental contact with one another. Thus, they found themselves doomed to separation. And since their life tempo was so slow, they seemed to themselves to have scarcely found one another before they must be parted. Bitterly they regretted the blindness of their infancy, for as they reached maturity they conceived, one and all, not merely the passion of mutual delight, which we call love, but also the conviction that through mental union with one another lay the way to union with the source whence they had come. When it had become clear that separation was inevitable, when indeed the hard-won community of these naive beings was already failing through the increased difficulty of communication, and the most remote nebulae were already receding from one another at high speed, each perforce made ready to face the mystery of existence in absolute solitude. There followed an aeon, or rather for the slow-living creatures themselves a brief spell, in which they sought, by self-mastery of their own flesh and by spiritual discipline, to find the supreme illumination which all awakened beings must, in their very nature, seek. But now there appeared a new trouble. Some of the eldest of the nebulae complained of a strange sickness which greatly hampered their meditations. The outer fringes of their tenuous flesh began to concentrate into little knots. These became in time grains of intense congested fire. In the void between, there was nothing left but a few stray atoms. At first the complaint was no more serious than some trivial rash on a man's skin, but later it spread into the deeper tissues of the nebula, and was accompanied by grave mental troubles. In vain the doomed creatures resolved to turn the plague to an advantage by treating it as a heaven-sent test of the spirit. Though for a while they might master the plague simply by heroic contempt of it, its ravages eventually broke down their will. It now seemed clear to them that the cosmos was a place of futility and horror. Presently the younger nebulae observed that their seniors, one by one, were falling into a state of sluggishness and confusion, which ended invariably in the sleep that men call death. Soon it became evident, even to the most buoyant spirit, that this disease was no casual accident, but a fate inherent in the nebular nature. One by one the celestial megatheria were annihilated, giving place to stars. Looking back on these events from my post in the far future, I, the rudimentary cosmical mind, tried to make known to the dying nebulae in the remote past of their death. Past that their death, far from being the end, was but an early stage in the life of the cosmos. It was my hope that I might give them consolation by imparting some idea of the vast and intricate future, and of my own final awakening. But it proved impossible to communicate with them. Though within the sphere of their ordinary experience, they were capable of a sort of intellection, beyond that sphere they were almost imbecile. As well might a man seek the comfort of the disintegrating germ cell from which he himself sprang by telling it about his own successful career in human society. Since this attempt to comfort was vain, I put aside compassion and was content merely to follow to its conclusion the collapse of the nebular community. Judged by human standards, the agony was immensely prolonged. It began with the disintegration of the eldest nebulae into stars, and it lasted, or will last, long after the destruction of the final human race on Neptune. Indeed, the last of the nebulae did not sink into complete unconsciousness till many of the corpses of its neighbors had already been transformed into symbiotic societies of stars and minded worlds. But To the slow-living nebulae themselves, the plague seemed a galloping disease. One after the other, each great religious beast found itself at grips with the subtle enemy, and fought a gallant losing fight until stupor overwhelmed it. None ever knew that its crumpling flesh teemed with the young and swifter lives of stars, or that it was already sprinkled here and there with the incomparably smaller, incomparably swifter, and incomparably richer lives of creatures such as men, whose crowded ages of history were all compressed within the last few distressful moments of the primeval monsters. End of part 1. Okay. All right, one more little sip. Okay. Part 2. The supreme moment nears. The discovery of nebular life deeply moved the incipient cosmical mind that I had become. Patiently, I studied those almost formless megatheria, absorbing into my own composite being the fervor of their simple but deep-running nature. For these simple creatures sought their goal with a single-mindedness and passion eclipsing all the worlds and stars. With such earnest imagination did I enter into their history that I myself, the cosmical mind, was in a manner remade by contemplation of these beings. Considering from the nebular point of view the vast complexity and subtlety of the living worlds, I began to wonder whether the endless divagations of the worlds were really due so much to the richness of being as to weakness of spiritual perception, so much to the immensely varied potentiality of their nature as to sheer lack of any intense controlling experience. A compass needle that is but feebly magnetized swings again and again to west and east, and takes long to discover its proper direction. One that is more sensitive will settle immediately toward the north. Had the sheer complexity of every world, with its host of minute yet complex members, merely confused its sense of the proper direction of all spirit? Had the simplicity and spiritual vigor of the earliest, hugest beings achieved something of highest value that the complexity and subtlety of the world had never achieved? But no. Excellent as the nebular mentality was in its own strange way, the stellar and the planetary mentalities had also their special virtues, and of all three, the planetary must be most prized, since it could best comprehend all three. I now allowed myself to believe that since I did at last include in my own being an intimate awareness not only of many galaxies but also of the first phase of cosmical life, might now with some justice regard myself as the incipient mind of the cosmos as a whole. But the awakened galaxies that supported me were still only a small minority of the total population of galaxies. By telepathic influence, I continued to help on those many galaxies that were upon the threshold of mental maturity. If I could include within the cosmical community of awakened galaxies some hundreds instead of a mere score of members, perhaps I myself, the communal mind, might be so strengthened as to rise from my present state of arrested mental infancy to something more like maturity. It was clear to me that even now, in my embryonic state, I was ripening for some new elucidation, and that with good fortune I might yet find myself in the presence of that which, in the human language of this book, has been called the Star Maker. At this time, my longing for that presence had become an overmastering passion. It seemed to me that the veil, which still hid the source and goal of all nebulae and stars and worlds, was already dissolving. That which had kindled so many myriad beings to worship, yet had clearly revealed itself to none, that toward which all beings had blindly striven, representing it to themselves by the images of a myriad divinities, was now, I felt, on the point of revelation to me, the marred but still growing spirit of the cosmos. I, who had myself been worshipped by hosts of my little members, I, whose achievement reached far beyond their dreams, was now oppressed, overwhelmed by the sense of my own littleness and imperfection, for the veiled presence of the Star Maker already overmastered me with dreadful power. The further I ascended along the path of the spirit, the loftier appeared the heights that lay before me. For what I had once thought to be the summit fully revealed was now seen to be a mere foothill. Beyond lay the real ascent, steep, cragged, glacial, rising into the dark mist. Never, never should I climb that precipice. And yet I must go forward. Dread was overcome by irresistible craving. Meanwhile, under my influence and immature galaxies one by one attained that pitch of lucidity which enabled them to join the cosmical community and enrich me with their special experience. But physically the enfeeblement of the cosmos continued. By the time that half the total population of galaxies had reached maturity, it became clear that few more would succeed. Of living stars, very few were left in the galaxy. Of the host of dead stars, some, subjected to atomic disintegration, were being used as artificial suns, and were surrounded by many thousands of artificial planets. But the great majority of the stars were now encrusted, and themselves peopled. After a while, it became necessary to evacuate all planets, since the artificial suns were too extravagant of energy. The planet-dwelling races, therefore, one by one, destroyed themselves, bequeathing the material of their worlds and all their wisdom to the inhabitants of the extinguished stars. Henceforth, the cosmos, once a swarm of blazing galaxies, each a swarm of stars, was composed wholly of star corpses. These dark grains drifted through the dark void like an infinitely tenuous smoke rising from an extinguished fire. Upon these motes, these gigantic worlds, the ultimate populations had created here and there with their artificial lighting a pale glow, invisible even from the innermost ring of lifeless planets. By far the commonest type of being in these stellar worlds was the intelligent swarm of minute worms or insectoids. But there were also many races of larger creatures of a very curious kind adapted to the prodigious gravitation of their giant worlds. Each of these creatures was a sort of living blanket. Its undersurface bore a host of tiny legs that were also mouths. That is disgusting and terrifying. Tiny legs that were also mouths. Gross. These supported a body that was never more than an inch thick, though it might be as much as a couple yards wide and 10 yards long. At the forward and manipulatory arms traveled on their own battalions of legs. The upper surface of the body contained a honeycomb of breathing pores and a great variety of sense organs. Between the two surfaces spread the organs of metabolism and the vast area of brain. Compared with the worm swarms and insect swarms, these tripe-like beings had the advantage of more secure mental unity and greater specialization of organs, but they were more cumbersome and less adapted to the subterranean life which was later to be forced on all populations. The huge, dark worlds, with their immense weight of atmosphere and their incredible breadth of ocean, where the waves, even in the most furious storms, were never more than ripples such as we know on Quicksilver, were soon congested with the honeycomb civilizations of worms and insectoids of many species, and the more precarious shelters of the tribe-like creatures. Life on these worlds was almost like life in a two-dimensional flatland. Even the most rigid of the artificial elements was too weak to allow of lofty structures. As time advanced, the internal heat of the encrusted stars was used up, and it became necessary to support civilization by atomic disintegration of the star's rocky core. Thus, in time, each stellar world became an increasingly hollow sphere, supported by a system of great internal buttresses. One by one, the populations, or rather the new and specially adapted descendants of the former populations, retired into the interiors of the burnt-out stars. Each imprisoned in its hollow world, and physically isolated from the rest of the cosmos, these populations telepathically supported the cosmical mind. These were my flesh, in the inevitable expansion of the universe. The dark galaxies had already for eons been flying apart so rapidly that light itself could not have bridged the gulf between them. But this prodigious disintegration of the cosmos was of less account to the ultimate populations than the physical insulations of star from star through the cessations of all stellar radiation and all interstellar travel. The many populations, teeming in the galleries of the many worlds, maintained their telepathic union. Intimately, they knew one another in all their diversity. Together, they supported the communal mind with all its awareness of the whole vivid, intricate past of the cosmos, and its tireless effort to achieve its spiritual goal before increase of entropy should destroy the tissue of civilizations in which it inhered. Such was the condition of the cosmos when it approached to the supreme moment of its career, and the illumination toward which all beings in all ages had been obscurely striving. Strange it was that these later-day populations, cramped and impoverished, counting their last pence of energy, should achieve the task that had defeated the brilliant hosts of earlier epochs. Theirs was indeed the case of the wren that outsoared the eagle. In spite of their straitened circumstances, they were still able to maintain the essential structure of the cosmical community and a cosmical mentality. And with native insight, they could use the past to deepen their wisdom far beyond the range of any past wisdom. The supreme moment of the cosmos was not, or will not be, a moment of human standards, but by cosmical standards it was, indeed, a brief instant, when little more than half the total population of many million galaxies had entered fully into the cosmical community, and it was clear that no more were to be expected. There followed a period of universal meditation. The populations maintained their straitened utopian civilizations, lived their personal lives of work and social intercourse, and at the same time, upon the communal plane, refashioned the whole structure of cosmical culture. Of this phase I shall say nothing. Suffice it that to each galaxy and to each world was assigned a special creative mental function, and that all assimilated the work of all. At the close of this period, I, the communal mind, emerged remade as from a chrysalis, and for a brief moment, which was indeed the supreme moment of the cosmos, I faced the Star Maker. Has the moment come? It is time. For the human author of this book, there is now nothing left of that age-long, that eternal moment which I experienced as the cosmical mind, save the recollection of a bitter beatitude, together with a few incoherent memories of the experience itself, which fired me with that beatitude. Somehow I must tell something of that experience. Inevitably, I faced the task with a sense of abysmal incompetence. The greatest minds of the human race, through all the ages of human history, have failed to describe their moments of deepest insight. Then how dare I attempt this task? And yet, I must. Even at the risk of well-merited ridicule and attempt and moral censure, I must stammer out what I have seen. If a shipwrecked seaman on his raft is swept helplessly past marvelous coasts and then home again, he cannot hold his peace. The cultivated may turn away in disgust at his rude accent and clumsy diction. The knowing may laugh at his failure to distinguish between fact and illusion, but speak he must. That was the end of part 2. We're doing it. It's happening. We're meeting the Star Maker. Are we excited? Because I'm excited. So excited that I just like clanked my teeth with my cup. We're doing it. We're doing it. All right. It's almost that moment where it's like, oh, you know that it's starting to like wind down because like the anticipation is building and building and building and now it's here, which means that we're gonna slowly like get all of our resolutions. Am I ready for this? We'll see. Part 3. The supreme moment and after. In the supreme moment of the cosmos, I, as the cosmical mind, seemed to myself to be confronted with the source and the goal of all finite things. I did not, of course, in that moment sensuously perceive the infinite spirit, the Star Maker. Sensuously, I perceived nothing but what I had perceived before, the populous interiors of many dying stellar worlds. Stellar worlds, not stellular. Just throwing in letters that don't belong. But through the medium, which in this book is called telepathic, I was now given a more inward perception. I felt the immediate presence of the Star Maker. Latterly, as I have said, I had already been powerfully seized by a sense of the veiled presence of some being other than myself, other than my cosmical body and conscious mind, other than my living members and the swarms of the burnt-out stars. But now the veil trembled, and grew half-transparent to the mental vision. The source and goal of all, the Star Maker, was obscurely revealed to me as a being indeed other than my conscious self, objective to my vision, yet as in the depth of my own nature, as indeed myself, though infinitely more than myself. You can tell that I'm getting excited because I keep messing up words. I'm just too excited. I'm throwing in letters. I'm mixing up words. It's fine. It seemed to me that I now saw the Star Maker in two aspects, as the spirit's particular creative mode that had given rise to me, cosmos, and also, most dreadfully, as something incomparably greater than creativity, namely as the eternity achieved perfection of the absolute spirit. Barren. Barren and trivial are these words, but not barren the experience. Confronted with this infinity that lay deeper than my deepest roots and higher than my topmost reach, I, the cosmical mind, the flower of all the stars and worlds, was appalled, as any savage is appalled by the lightning and the thunder. And as I fell abject before the Star Maker, my mind was flooded with a spate of images. The fictitious deities of all races and all worlds once more crowded themselves upon me, symbols of majesty and tenderness, of ruthless power, of blind creativity, and of all-seeing wisdom. And though these images were but the fantasies of created minds, it seemed to me that one and all did indeed embody some true feature of the Star Maker's impact upon the creatures. As I contemplated the host of deities that rose to me like a smoke cloud from the many worlds, a new image, a new symbol of the infinite spirit, took shape in my mind. Though born of my own cosmical imagination, it was begotten by a greater than I. To the human writer of this book, little remains of that vision which so abashed and exalted me as the cosmical mind, but I must strive to recapture it in a feeble net of words as best I may. There's a lot of preamble and a lot of build-up for this. It seemed to me that I had reached back through time to the moment of creation. I watched the birth of the cosmos. The spirit brooded, though infinite and eternal. It had limited itself with finite and temporal being, and it brooded on a past that pleased it not. It was dissatisfied with some past creation hidden from me, and it was dissatisfied also with its own passing nature. Discontent goaded the spirit into fresh creation. But now, according to the fantasy that my cosmical mind conceived, the absolute spirit, self-limited for creativity, objectified from itself an atom of its infinite potentiality. This microcosm was pregnant with the germ of a proper time and space, and all the kinds of cosmical beings. Within this punctual cosmos, the myriad, but not outnumbered, physical centers of power, which men conceive vaguely as electrons, protons, and the rest, were at first coincident with one another, and they were dormant. The matter of 10 million galaxies lay dormant in a point. Then the Star Maker said, "Let there be light." And there was light. From all the coincident. How many different places can I put the stress? From all the coincident and punctual centers of power, light leapt and blazed. The cosmos exploded, actualizing its potentiality of space and time. The centers of power, like fragments of a bursting bomb, were hurled apart. But each one retained in itself, as a memory and a longing, the single spirit of the whole, and each mirrored in itself aspects of all others throughout all the cosmical space and time. No longer punctual, the cosmos was now a volume of inconceivably dense matter and inconceivably violent radiation, constantly expanding. And it was a sleeping and infinitely dissociated spirit. But to say that the cosmos was expanding is equally to say that its members were contracting, each at first coincident with the punctual cosmos, themselves generated the cosmical space of their disengagement from one another. The expansion of the whole cosmos was but the shrinkage of all its physical units and of the wavelengths of its light. Though the cosmos was ever of finite bulk in relation to its minutiae of light waves, it was boundless and centerless. As the surface of a swelling sphere lacks boundary and center, so the swelling volume of the cosmos was boundless and centerless. But as the spherical surface is centered on a point foreign to it in a third dimension, so the volume of the cosmos was centered in a point foreign to it in a fourth dimension. The congested and exploding cloud of fire swelled till it was of a planet's size, a star's size, the size of a whole galaxy and of 10 million galaxies. And in swelling it became more tenuous, less brilliant, less turbulent. Presently, the cosmical cloud was disrupted by the stress of its expansion in conflict with the mutual clinging of its parts, disrupted into many million cloudlets, the swarm of the great nebulae. For a while these were as close to one another in relation to their bulk as the flocculations of a mottled sky. But the channels between them widened till they were separated as flowers on a bush, as bees in a flying swarm, as birds migrating, as ships on the sea. More and more rapidly they retreated from one another, and at the same time each cloud contracted, becoming first a ball of down, and then a spinning lens, and then a featured whirl of star streams. Still, the cosmos expanded, till the galaxies that were most remote from one another were flying apart so swiftly that the creeping light of the cosmos could no longer bridge the gulf between them. But I, with imaginative vision, retained sight of them all. It was as though some hyper-cosmical and instantaneous light issuing from nowhere in the cosmical space illuminated all things inwardly. Once more, but in a new and cold and penetrating light, I watched all the lives of stars and worlds and of the galactic communities and of myself, up to the moment wherein now I stood, confronted by the infinity that men call God and conceive according to their human cravings. I, too, now sought to capture the infinite spirit, the Star-Maker, in an image spun by my own finite, though cosmical, nature. For now it seemed, that I suddenly outgrew the three-dimensional vision proper to all creatures, and that I saw with physical sight the Star-Maker. I saw, though nowhere in cosmical space, the blazing source of the hypercosmical light, as though it were an overwhelmingly brilliant point, a star, a sun more powerful than all suns together. It seemed to me that this effulgent star was the center of a four-dimensional sphere whose curved surface was the three-dimensional cosmos. This star of stars, this star that was indeed the Star-Maker, was perceived by me, its cosmical creature, for one moment before its splendor seared my vision. And in that moment I knew that I had indeed seen the very source of all cosmical light and life and mind, and of how much else besides I had as yet no knowledge. But this image, this symbol that my cosmical mind had conceived under the stress of inconceivable experience, broke and was transformed in the very act of my conceiving it. So inadequate was it to the actuality of the experience. Harking back in my blindness to the moment of my vision, I now conceived that the star which was the star-maker and the immanent center of all existence had been perceived as looking down on me, his creature, from the height of his infinitude, and that when I saw him, I immediately spread the poor wings of my spirit to soar up to him, only to be blinded and seared and struck down. It had seemed to me in the moment of my vision that all the longing and hope of all finite spirits for union with the infinite spirit were strength to my wings. It seemed to me that the star, my maker, must surely stoop to meet me and raise me and enfold me in his radiance. For it seemed to me that I, the spirit of so many worlds, the flower of so many ages, was the church cosmical, fit at last to be the bride of God. But instead, I was blinded and seared and struck down by terrible light. It was not only physical effulgence that struck me down in that supreme moment of my life. In that moment I guessed what mood it was of the infinite spirit that had in fact made the cosmos and constantly supported it, watching its tortured growth. And it was that discovery which felled me. For I had been confronted not by welcoming and kindly love, but by a very different spirit. And at once I knew that the Star-Maker had made me not to be his bride, nor yet his treasured child, but for some other end. It seemed to me that he gazed down on me from the height of his divinity with the aloof, though passionate attention of an artist judging his finished work, calmly rejoicing in its achievement, but recognizing at last the irrevocable flaws in its initial conception, and already lusting for fresh creation. His gaze anatomized me with calm skill, dismissing my imperfections, and absorbing for his own enrichment all the little excellence that I had won in the struggle of the ages. In my agony, I cried out against my ruthless maker. I cried out that, after all, the creature was nobler than the creator, for the creature loved and craved love, even from the star that was the star-maker, but the creator, the star-maker, neither loved nor had need of love. But no sooner had I, in my blinded misery, cried out, than I was struck dumb with shame. For suddenly it was clear to me that virtue in the creator is not the same as virtue in the creature. For the creator, if he should love his creature, would be loving only a part of himself. But the creature, praising the creator, praises an infinity beyond himself. I saw that the virtue of the creature was to love and to worship, but the virtue of the creator was to create and to be infinite, the unrealizable and incomprehensible goal of worshipping creatures. Once more, but in shame and adoration, I cried out to my Maker. I said, "It is enough and far more than enough to be the creature of so dread and lovely a spirit, whose potency is infinite, whose nature passes the comprehension even of a minded cosmos. It is enough to have been created, to have embodied for a moment the infinite and tumultuously and tumulously, excuse me, I'm just, again, creating so many different words, creative spirit. It is infinitely more than enough to have been used, to have been the rough sketch for some perfected creation." And so there came upon me a strange peace and a strange joy. Exactly. I am the word maker, and you are just meeting me now. Looking into the future, I saw without sorrow, rather with quiet interest, my own decline and fall. I saw the populations of the stellar worlds use up more and more of their resources for the maintenance of their frugal civilizations. So much of the interior matter of the stars did they disintegrate that their worlds were in danger of collapse. Some worlds did indeed crash in fragments upon their hollow centers, destroying the indwelling peoples. Most, before the critical point was reached, were remade, patiently taken to pieces and rebuilt upon a smaller scale. One by one, each star was turned into a world of merely planetary size. Some were no bigger than the moon. The populations themselves were reduced to a mere millionth of their original numbers, maintaining within each little hollow grain a mere skeleton civilization in conditions that became increasingly penurious. Looking into the future eons from the supreme moment of the cosmos, I saw the populations still, with all their strength, maintaining the essentials of their ancient culture, still living their personal lives in zest and endless novelty of action, still practicing telepathic intercourse between worlds, still telepathically sharing all that was of value in their respective world spirits, still supporting a truly cosmical community with its single cosmical mind. I saw myself still preserving, though with increasing difficulty, my lucid consciousness, battling against the onset of drowsiness and senility, no longer in the hope of winning through to any more glorious state than that which I had already known, or of laying a less inadequate jewel of worship before the Star Maker, but simply out of sheer hunger for experience and out of loyalty of spirit. But inevitably decay overtook me. World after world, battling with increasing economic difficulties, was forced to reduce its population below the number needed for the functioning of its own communal mentality. Then, like a degenerating brain center, it could no longer fulfill its part in the cosmical experience. Looking forward from my station in the supreme moment of the cosmos, I saw myself, the cosmical mind, sink steadily toward death. But in this my last eon, when all my powers were waning and the burden of my decaying body pressed heavily on my enfeebled courage, an obscure memory of past lucidity still consoled me. For confusedly I knew that even in this my last, most piteous age, I was still under the zestful though remote gaze of the Star Maker. Still probing the future, from the moment of my supreme unwithered maturity I saw my death, the final breaking of those telepathic contacts on which my being depended. Thereafter the few surviving worlds lived on in absolute isolation, and in that barbarian condition which men call civilized. Then in world after world, the basic skills of material civilization began to fail, and in particular the techniques of atomic disintegration and photosynthesis. World after world either accidentally exploded its little remaining store of matter and was turned into a spreading, fading sphere of light waves in the immense darkness, or else died miserably of starvation and cold. Presently, nothing was left in the whole cosmos but darkness and the dark whiffs of dust that once were galaxies. Eons incalculable passed. Little by little each whiff of dust grains contracted upon itself through the gravitational influence of its parts, till at last, not without fiery collisions between wandering grains, all the matter in each whiff was concentrated to become a single lump. The pressure of the huge outer regions heated the center of each lump to incandescence and even to explosive activity. But little by little, the last resources of the cosmos were radiated away from the cooling lumps, and nothing was left but rock and the inconceivably faint ripples of radiation that crept in all directions throughout the ever-expanding cosmos. Far too slowly to bridge the increasing gulfs between the islanded grains of rock. Meanwhile, since each rocky sphere that had once been a galaxy had been born beyond every possible physical influence of its fellows, and there were no minds to maintain telepathic contact between them, each was in effect a wholly distinct universe. The proper time of each barren universe had also ceased. Since this apparently was to be the static and eternal end, I withdrew my fatigued attention back once more to the supreme moment, which was in fact my present, or rather, my immediate past. And with the whole mature power of my mind, I tried to see more clearly what it was that had been present to me in that immediate past. For in that instant when I had seen the blazing star that was the Star Maker, I had glimpsed, in the very eye of that splendor, strange vistas of being, as though in the depths of this hyper-cosmical past and the hyper-cosmical future also, yet coexistent in eternity, lay cosmos beyond cosmos. That's the end of chapter 13. We did it. We have seen the Star Maker. But I am unable to explain what the Star Maker looks like. Just as we in the story are unable to explain what the Star Maker looks like. And I think it's so interesting that the Star Maker, after creating something, is like the comparison of being like an artist, where you like analyze and you're like, I think I'm done with this. I'm ready to move on. I find that interesting. All right. Chapter 14. The Myth of Creation. A walker in mountainous country, lost in mist and groping from rock to rock, may come suddenly out of the cloud to find himself on the very brink of a precipice. Below he sees valleys and hills, plains, rivers, and intricate cities, the sea with all its islands, and overhead the sun. So I, in the supreme moment of my cosmical experience, emerged from the mist of my finitude to be confronted by cosmos upon cosmos, and by the light itself that not only illumines, but gives life to all. Then immediately the mist closed in upon me again. That strange vision, inconceivable to my finite mind, even of cosmical stature, I cannot possibly describe. I, the little human individual, am now infinitely removed from it, and even to the cosmical mind itself it was most baffling. Yet if I were to say nothing whatever of the content of my adventure's crowning moment, I should belie the spirit of the whole, though human language and even human thought itself are perhaps in their very nature incapable of metaphysical truth. Something I must somehow contrive to express, even if only by metaphor. All I can do is to record, as best I may with my poor human powers, something of the vision's strange and tumultuous after effect upon my own cosmical imagination, when the intolerable lucidity had already blinded me, and I gropingly strove to recollect what it was that had appeared. For in my blindness the vision did invoke from my stricken mind a fantastic reflex of itself, an echo, a symbol, a myth, a crazy dream, contemptibly crude and falsifying, yet, as I believe, not wholly without significance. So I super appreciate that we are unable to succinctly describe the Star Maker, which totally makes sense. Like, I didn't want a Star Maker to just be like some dude, you know? Like the Wizard of Oz. Like, you just pull the curtain behind and it's just like some regular guy. I like that we're unable to put into words exactly the experience, because that's what it is, more so, is the experience of being in the presence of the Star Maker. This poor myth, this mere parable, I shall recount, so far as I can remember it in my merely human state. More I cannot do, but even this I cannot properly accomplish. Not once, but many times, I have written down an account of my dream and then destroyed it. So inadequate was it. With a sense of utter failure, I stammeringly report only a few of its most intelligible characters. One feature of the actual vision my myth represented in a most perplexing and inadequate manner. It declared that the supreme moment of my experience, as the cosmical mind actually comprised eternity within it, and that within eternity there lay a multiplicity of temporal sequences wholly distinct from one another. For though in eternity all times are present, and the infinite spirit, being perfect, must comprise in itself the full achievement of all possible creations, yet this could not be unless in its finite, its temporal and creative mode, the infinite and absolute spirit conceived and executed the whole vast series of creations. For creation's sake, the eternal and infinite spirit entails time within its entire eternity, contains the whole protracted sequence of creation. In my dream, the Star Maker himself, as eternal and absolute spirit, timelessly contemplated all his works, but also as the finite and creative mode of the absolute spirit. He bodied forth his creations one after the other in a time sequence proper to his own adventure and growth. And further, each of his works, each cosmos, was itself gifted with its own peculiar time, in such a manner that the whole sequence of events within any single cosmos could be viewed by the Star Maker not only from within the cosmical time itself, but also externally, from the time proper to its own life, with all the cosmical epochs coexisting together. According to the strange dream or myth which took possession of my mind, the Star Maker in his finite and creative mode was actually a developing, an awakening spirit. That he should be so, and yet also eternally perfect, is, of course, humanly inconceivable. But my mind, overburdened with superhuman vision, found no other means of expressing to itself the mystery of creation. Eternally, so my dream declared to me, the Star Maker is perfect and absolute. Yet in the beginning of the time proper to its creative mode, he was an infant deity, restless, eager, mighty, but without clear will. He was equipped with all creative power. He could make universes with all kinds of physical and mental attributes. He was limited only by logic. Thus, he could ordain the most surprising natural laws, but he could not, for instance, make twice 2 equal 5. In his early phase, he was limited only by his immaturity. He was still in the trance of infancy, though the unconscious source of his consciously exploring and creating mentality was none other than his own eternal essence. Consciously, he was at first but the vague, blind hunger of creativity. In his beginning, he immediately set about exploring his power. He objectified from himself something of his own unconscious substance to be the medium of his art, and this he molded with conscious purpose. Thus, again and again, he fashioned toy cosmos after toy cosmos. But the creative Starmaker's own unconscious substance was none other than the eternal spirit itself, the Starmaker in his eternal and perfect aspect. Thus it was that, in his immature phases, whenever he evoked from his own depth the crude substance of a cosmos, the substance itself turned out to be not formless, but rich in determinate potentialities, logical, physical, biological, psychological. These potentialities were sometimes recalcitrant to the conscious purpose of the young Starmaker. He could not always accommodate, still less fulfill them. It seemed to me that this idiosyncrasy of the medium itself often defeated his plan, but also that it suggested again and again more fertile conceptions. Again and again, according to my myth, the Starmaker learned from his creature, and thereby outgrew his creature, and craved to work upon an ampler plan. Again and again, he set aside a finished cosmos, and evoked from himself a new creation. Many times in the early part of my dream, I felt doubt as to what the Starmaker was striving to accomplish in his creating. I could not believe that his purpose was at first not clearly conceived. He himself had evidently to discover it gradually, and often, as it seemed to me, his work was tentative, and his aim confused. But at the close of his maturity, he willed to create as fully as possible, to call forth the full potentiality of his medium, to fashion works of increasing subtlety and of increasingly harmonious diversity. As his purpose became clearer, it seemed also to include the will to create universes, each of which might contain some unique achievement of awareness and expression. For the creature's achievement of perception and of will was seemingly the instrument by which the Starmaker himself, cosmos by cosmos, woke into keener lucidity. Thus it was that, through the succession of his creatures, the Starmaker advanced from stage to stage in the progress from infantile to mature divinity. Thus it was that in the end he became what, in the eternal view, he was already in the beginning, the ground and crown of all things. In the typically irrational manner of dreams, this dream myth, which arose in my mind, represented the eternal spirit as being at once the cause and the result of the infinite host of finite existence. In some unintelligible manner, all finite things, though they were in a sense figments of the absolute spirit, were also essential to the very existence of the absolute spirit. Apart from them, it had no being. But whether this obscure relationship represented some important truth, or was merely a trivial dream fiction, I cannot say. That is the end of chapter 14. All right, how many times are we going to say that the Starmaker was a baby? Just just an infant. And how many different ways are we going to say this? A lot, it seems. So it seems. All right. This is a longer chapter. Let's do it. Chapter 15. Just kidding. I want to resettle. Okay. Okay. Chapter 15. The Maker and His Works. Part 1. Immature Creating. According to the fantastic myth or dream that was evoked from my mind after the supreme moment of experience, the particular cosmos which I had come to regard as myself falls somewhere neither early nor late in the vast series of creations. It appeared to be in some respects the Star Maker's first mature work, but in comparison with later creations, it was in many ways juvenile in spirit. Though the early creations express the nature of the Star Maker merely in his immature phase, for the most part they fall in important respects aside from the direction of human thought, and therefore I cannot now recapture them. They have left me with little more than a vague sense of the multiplicity and diversity of the Star Maker's works. Nevertheless, a few humanly intelligible traces remain and must be recorded. In the crude medium of my dream, the first cosmos of all appeared as a surprisingly simple thing. The infant Star Maker, teased, as it seemed to me, by his unexpressed potency, conceived and objectified from himself two qualities. With these alone he made his first toy cosmos, a temporal rhythm, as it were, of sound and silence. From this first simple drumbeat, premonitory of 1,000 creations, he developed with infantile but godlike zest a flickering tattoo, a changeful complexity of rhythm. Presently, through contemplation of his creature's simple form, he conceived the possibility of more subtle creating. Thus, the first of all creatures itself bred in its creator a need that itself could never satisfy. Therefore, the infant Star Maker brought his first cosmos to a close. Regarding it from outside the cosmical time which it had generated, he apprehended its whole career as present, though none the less a flux. And when he had quietly assessed his work, he withdrew his attention from it and brooded for a second creation. Thereafter, cosmos after cosmos, each more rich and subtle than the last, leapt from his fervent imagination. In some of his earliest creations, he seemed to be concerned only with the physical aspect of the substance which he had objectified from himself. He was blind to its psychical potentiality. In one early cosmos, however, the patterns of physical quality with which he played simulated an individuality and a life which they did not, in fact, possess. Or did they possess it? In a later creation, certainly, true life broke out most strangely. This was a cosmos which the Star Maker apprehended physically much as men apprehend music. It was a rich sequence of qualities diverse in pitch and intensity. With this toy, the infant Star Maker played delightedly, inventing an infinite wealth of melody and counterpoint. But before he had worked out all the subtleties of pattern implied in this little world of cold, mathematical music, before he had created more than a few kinds of lifeless musical creatures, it became evident that some of his creatures were manifesting traces of a life of their own, recalcitrant to the conscious purpose of the Star Maker. The themes of the music began to display modes of behavior that were not in accord with the canon which he had ordained for them. It seemed to me that he watched them with intense interest, and that they spurred him to new conceptions beyond the creature's power to fulfill. Therefore, he brought this cosmos to completion, and in a novel manner. He contrived that in the last state of the cosmos should lead immediately back to the first. He knotted the final event temporally to the beginning, so that the cosmical time formed an endless circlet. After considering his work from outside its proper time, he set it aside and brooded for a fresh creation. For the next cosmos, he consciously projected something of his own percipience and will, ordaining that certain patterns and rhythms of quality should be the perceivable bodies of perceiving minds. Seemingly, these creatures were intended to work together to produce the harmony which he had conceived for this cosmos. But instead, each sought to mold the whole cosmos in accordance with its own form. The creatures fought desperately, and with self-righteous conviction. When they were damaged, they suffered pain. This, seemingly, was something which the young Star Maker had never experienced or conceived. With rapt, surprised interest, and, as it seemed to me, with almost diabolical glee, he watched the antics and the suffering of his first living creatures, till by their mutual strife and slaughter they had reduced this cosmos to chaos. Thenceforth, the Star Maker never for long ignored his creatures' potentiality for intrinsic life. It seemed to me, however, that many of his early experiments in vital creation went strangely awry, and that sometimes, seemingly in disgust with the biological, he would revert for a while to purely physical fantasies. I can only briefly describe the host of the early creations. Suffice it that they issued from the divine, though still infantile imagination, one after the other, like bright but trivial bubbles, gaudy with color, rich with all manner of physical subtleties, lyrical and often tragic with the loves and hates and the lusts and aspirations and communal enterprises of the Star Maker's early experimental conscious beings. Many of these early universes were non-spatial, though none the less physical. And of these non-spatial universes, not a few were of the musical type, in which space was strangely represented by a dimension corresponding to musical pitch and capacious with myriad of tonal differences. The creatures appeared to one another as a complex pattern and rhythms of tonal characters. They could move their tonal bodies in the dimension of pitch, and sometimes in other dimensions, humanly inconceivable. A creature's body was a more or less constant tonal pattern, with much the same degree of flexibility and minor changefulness as a human body. Also, it could traverse other living bodies in the pitch dimension, much as wave trains on a pond may cross one another. But though these beings could glide through one another, they could also grapple and damage one another's tonal issues. Some, indeed, lived by devouring others, for the most complex needed to integrate into their own vital patterns the simpler patterns that exfoliated throughout the cosmos directly from the creative power of the Star Maker. The intelligent creatures could manipulate for their own ends elements wrenched from the fixed tonal environment thus constructing artifacts of tonal pattern. Some of these served as tools for the more efficient pursuits of agricultural activities, by which they enhanced the abundance of their natural food. Universes of this non-spatial kind, though incomparably simpler and more meager than our own cosmos, were rich enough to produce societies capable not only of agriculture but of handicrafts, and even a kind of pure art that combined the characteristics of song and dance and verse. Philosophy, generally rather Pythagorean, appeared for the first time in a cosmos of this musical kind. In nearly all of the Star Maker's works, as revealed in my dream, time was a more fundamental attribute than space, though in some of his earliest creations he excluded time. Embodying merely a static design, this plan was soon abandoned. It gave little scope to his skill. Moreover, since it excluded the possibility of life and mind, it was incompatible with all but the earliest phase of his interest. Space, my dream declared, appeared first as a development of a non-spatial dimension in a musical cosmos. The tonal creatures in this cosmos could move not merely up and down the scale, but sideways. In human music, particular themes may seem to approach or retreat owing to variations of loudness and timbre. In a rather similar manner, the creatures in this musical cosmos could approach one another or retreat and finally vanish out of earshot. In passing sideways, they traveled through continuously changing tonal environments. In a subsequent cosmos, this sideways motion of the creatures was enriched with true spatial experience. There followed creations with spatial characters of several dimensions, creations Euclidean and non-Euclidean, creations exemplifying a great diversity of geometrical and physical principles. Sometimes time, or space-time, was the fundamental reality of the cosmos, and the entities were but fleeting modifications of it. But more often, qualitative events were fundamental, and these were related to spatio-temporal manners. In some cases, the system of spatial relations was infinite, in others infinite though boundless. In some, the finite extent of space was of constant magnitude in relation to the atomic material constituents of the cosmos. In some, as in our own cosmos, it was manifested as in many respects expanding. In others, again, space contracted, so that the end of such a cosmos, rich perhaps in intelligent communities, was the collision and congestion of all its parts, and their final coincidence and vanishing into dimensionless points. In some creations, expansion and ultimate quiescence were followed by contraction and entirely new kinds of physical activity. Sometimes, for example, gravity was replaced by anti-gravity. All large lumps of matter tended to burst asunder, and all small ones to fly apart from each other. In one such cosmos, the law of entropy also was reversed. Energy, instead of gradually spreading itself evenly throughout the cosmos, gradually piled itself upon the ultimate material units. I came in time to suspect that my own cosmos was followed by a reversed cosmos of this kind, in which, of course, the nature of living things was profoundly different from anything conceivable to man. But this is a digression, for I am at present describing much earlier and simpler universes. Many a universe was physically a continuous fluid in which the solid creatures swam. Others were constructed as series of concentric spheres, peopled by diverse orders of creatures. Some quite early universes were quasi-astronomical, consisting of a void sprinkled with rare and minute centers of power. Sometimes the Star Maker fashioned a cosmos which was without any single objective physical nature. Its creatures were wholly without influence on one another, but under the direct stimulation the Star Maker, each creature conceived an illusory but reliable and useful physical world of its own, and peopled it with figments of its imagination. These subjective worlds the mathematical genius of the Star Maker correlated in a manner that was perfectly systematic. I must not say more of the immense diversity of physical form which, according to my dream, the early creations assumed. It is enough to mention that, in general, each cosmos was more complex, and in a sense more voluminous, voluminous, there we go. It's like we're gonna get there. I know how to say this word. Voluminous. Beautiful. Then the last. For in each, the ultimate physical units were smaller in relation to the whole and more multitudinous. Also, in each, the individual conscious creatures were generally more in number and more diverse in type, and the more awakened in each cosmos reached a more lucid mentality than any creatures in the previous cosmos. Biologically and psychologically, the early creations were very diverse. In some cases, there was a biological evolution such as we know. A small minority of species would precariously ascend toward greater individuation and mental clarity. In other creations, the species were biologically fixed, and progress, if it occurred, was wholly cultural. In a few most perplexing creations, the most awakened state of the cosmos was at the beginning, and the Star Maker calmly watched this lucid consciousness decay. Sometimes the cosmos started as a single lowly organism with an internal, non-organic environment. It then propagated by fission into an increasing host of increasingly small and increasingly individuated and awakened creatures. In some of these universes, evolution would continue till the creatures became too minute to accommodate the complexity of organic structure necessary for intelligent minds. The Star Maker would then watch the cosmical societies desperately striving to circumvent the fated degeneration of their race. In some creations, the crowning achievement of the cosmos was a chaos of mutually unintelligible societies, each devoted to the service of some one mode of the spirit and hostile to the others. In some, the climax was a single utopian society of distinct minds. In others, a single composite cosmical mind. Sometimes it pleased the Star Maker to ordain that each creature in a cosmos should be an inevitable, determinate expression of the environment's impact on its ancestors and itself. In other creations, each creature had some power of arbitrary choice, and some modicum of the Star Maker's own creativity. So it seemed to me in my dream, but even in my dream I suspected that to a more subtle observer both kinds would have appeared as in fact determinate, and yet both of them also spontaneous and creative. In general, the Star Maker, once he had ordained the basic principles of a cosmos and created its initial state, was content to watch the issue. But sometimes he chose to interfere, either by infringing the natural laws that he himself had ordained, or by introducing new emergent formative principles, or by influencing the minds of the creatures by direct revelation. This, according to my dream, was sometimes done to improve a cosmical design, but, more often, interference was included in his original plan. Sometimes the Star Maker flung off creations which were in effect groups of many linked universes, wholly distinct physical systems of very different kinds, yet related by the fact that the creatures lived their lives successively in universe after universe, assuming in each habitat an indigenous physical form, but bearing with them in their transmigration faint and easily misinterpreted memories of earlier existences. In another way also, this principle of transmigration was sometimes used. Even creations were not thus systematically linked, might contain creatures that mentally echoed in some vague but haunting manner the experience or the temperament of their counterparts in some other cosmos. One very dramatic device was used in Cosmos After Cosmos. I mentioned earlier that in my dream the immature Star Maker had seemed to regard the tragic failure of his first biological experiment with a kind of diabolical glee. In many subsequent creations also he appeared to be twi-minded. Whenever his conscious, creative plan was thwarted by some unsuspected potentiality of the substance which he had objectified from his unconscious depth, his mood seemed to include not only frustration, but also surprised satisfaction, as of some unrecognized hunger unexpectedly satisfied. This twi-mindedness at length gave rise to a new mode of creating. There came a stage in the Star Maker's growth, as my dream represented it, when he contrived to dissociate himself as two independent spirits, the one his essential self, the spirit that sought positive creation of vital and spiritual forms and ever more lucid awareness, the other a rebellious, destructive, and cynical spirit that could have no being save as a parasite upon the works of the other. Again and again he dissociated these two modes of himself, objectified them as independent spirits, and permitted them to strive within a cosmos for mastery. One such cosmos, which consisted of 3 linked universes, was somewhat reminiscent of Christian orthodoxy. The first of these linked universes was inhabited by generations of creatures gifted with varying degrees of sensibility, intelligence, and moral integrity. Hence, here, the two spirits played for the souls of the creatures. The good spirit extorted, helped, rewarded, or not extorted, excuse me. The good spirit exhorted, helped, rewarded, punished. The evil spirit deceived, tempted, and morally destroyed. At death, the creatures passed into one or other of the 2 secondary universes, which constituted a timeless heaven and a timeless hell. There they experienced an eternal moment either of ecstatic comprehension and worship, or of the extreme torment of remorse. When my dream presented me with this crude, this barbaric figment, I was at first moved with horror and incredulity. How could the Star Maker, even in his immaturity, condemn his creatures to agony for the weakness that he himself had allotted to them? How could such a vindictive deity command worship? In vain I told myself that my dream must have utterly falsified the reality, for I was convinced that in this respect it was not false, but in some sense true, at least symbolically. Yet Even when I was confronted by this brutal deed, even in the revulsion of pity and horror, I saluted the Star Maker. To excuse my worship, I told myself that this dread mystery lay far beyond my comprehension, and that in some sense even such flagrant cruelty must, in the Star Maker, be right. Did barbarity, perhaps, belong to the Star Maker only in his immaturity? Later, when he was fully himself, would he finally outgrow it? No. I already deeply knew that this ruthlessness was to be manifested even in the ultimate cosmos. Could there, then, be some key fact overlooked by me, in virtue of which such seeming vindictiveness was justified? Was it simply that all creatures were indeed but figments of the creative power, and that in tormenting his creatures, the Star Maker did but torment himself in the course of his adventure of self-expression? Or was it perhaps that even the Star Maker himself, though mighty, was limited in all creation by certain absolute logical principles, and that one of these was the indissoluble bond between betrayal and remorse in half-awakened spirits? Had he, in this strange cosmos, simply accepted and used the ineluctable limitations of his art? Or again, was my respect given to the Star Maker only as the good spirit, and not the evil spirit? And was he, in fact, striving to eject evil from himself by means of this device of dissociation? Some such explanation was suggested by the strange evolution of this cosmos. Since its denizens had mostly a very low degree of intelligence and moral integrity, the hell was soon overcrowded, while the heaven remained mostly empty. But the Star Maker, in his good aspect, loved and pitied his creatures. The good spirit therefore entered into mundane sphere to redeem the sinners of his own suffering. And so at last the heaven was peopled, though the hell was not depopulated. Was it, then, only the good aspect of the Star Maker that I worshipped? No. Irrationally, yet with conviction, I gave my adoration to the Star Maker as comprising both aspects of his dual nature, both the good and the evil, both the mild and the terrible, both the humanly ideal and the incomprehensibly inhuman. Like an infatuated lover who denies or excuses the flagrant faults of the beloved, I strove to palliate the inhumanity of the Star Maker. Nay, positively, I gloried in it. Was there, then, something cruel in my own nature? Or did my heart vaguely recognize that love, the supreme virtue in creatures, must not, in the Creator, be absolute? This dire and insoluble problem confronted me again and again in the course of my dream. For instance, there appeared a creation in which the two spirits were permitted to strive in a novel and more subtle manner. In its early phase, this cosmos manifested only physical characters, but the Star Maker provided that its vital potentiality should gradually express itself in certain kinds of living creatures which, generation by generation, should emerge from the poorly physical and evolve toward intelligence and spiritual lucidity. In this cosmos, he permitted the two spirits, the good and the evil, to compete even in the very making of the creatures. In the long early ages, the spirits struggled over the evolution of the innumerable species. The good spirit worked to produce creatures more highly organized, more individual, more delicately related to the environment, more skilled in action, more comprehensively and vividly aware of their world, of themselves, and of other selves. The evil spirit tried to thwart this enterprise. The organs and tissues of every species manifested throughout their structure the conflict of the two spirits. Sometimes the evil spirit contrived seemingly unimportant but insidious and lethal features for the creature's undoing. Its nature would include some special liability to harbor parasites, some weakness of digestive machinery, some instability of nervous organization. In other cases, the evil spirit would equip some lower species with special weapons for the destruction of the pioneers of evolution, so that they should succumb either to some new disease or to plagues of the vermin of this particular cosmos, or to the more brutish of their own kind. A still more ingenious plan the evil spirit sometimes used with great effect. When the good spirit had hit upon some promising device, and from small beginnings had worked up in its favored species some new organic structure or mode of behavior, the evil spirit would contrive that the process of evolution should continue long after it had reached perfect adjustment to the creature's needs. Teeth would grow so large that eating became excessively difficult, protective shells so heavy that they hampered locomotion, horns so curved that they pressed upon the brain, the impulse to individuality so imperious that it destroyed society, or the social impulse so obsessive that individuality was crushed. Thus, in world after world of this cosmos, which greatly surpassed all earlier creations in complexity, almost every species came sooner or later to grief. But in some worlds, a single species reached the human level of intelligence and a spiritual sensibility. Such a combination of powers ought to have secured it from all possible attack. But both intelligence and spiritual sensibility were most skillfully perverted by the evil spirit. For though by nature they were complementary, they could be brought into conflict, or else one or both could be exaggerated so as to become as lethal as the extravagant horns and teeth of earlier kinds. Thus intelligence, which led on the one hand to the mastery of physical force and on the other to intellectual subtlety, might, if divorced from spiritual sensibility, cause disaster. The mastery of physical force often produced a mania for power, and the dissection of society into two alien classes, the powerful and the enslaved. Intellectual subtlety might produce a mania for analysis and abstraction, with blindness to all that intellect could not expound. Yet sensibility itself, when it rejected intellectual criticism and the claims of daily life, would be smothered in dreams. That is the end of part 1. Okay, so we have how the Star Maker created cosmos and worlds when the Star Maker was in its infancy, and the Star Maker is learning. So in those first couple worlds, Star Maker didn't know about pain, and it seemed almost like watching an ant, like doing weird things to an ant, like making a path or like blowing on it to like make it stumble and stuff like that. Like it seemed like that was happening. And then we have the idea that there's good and there's bad, and both of them are being used to combine the world instead of purely using good or purely using bad, and trying to have that balance to make it successful. Maybe. All right, part 2. Mature creating. According to the myth that my mind conceived when the supreme moment of my cosmical experience had passed, the Star Maker at length entered into a state of rapt meditation in which his own nature suffered a revolutionary change. So at least I judged from the great change that now came over his creative activity. After he had reviewed with new eyes all his earlier works, dismissing each, as it seemed to me, with mingled respect and impatience, he discovered in himself a new and pregnant conception. The cosmos which he now created was that which contains the readers and the writer of this book. In its making he used, but with more cunning art, many of the principles which had already served him in earlier creations, and he wove them together to form a more subtle and more capacious unity than ever before. Cool. So now we're reading about how the Star Maker creates our world. Nice. It seemed to me, in my fantasy, that he approached this new enterprise in a new mood. Each earlier cosmos appeared to have been fashioned with conscious will to embody certain principles, physical, biological, psychological. As has already been reported, there often appeared a conflict between his intellectual purpose and the raw nature which he had evoked for his creature out of the depth of his own obscure being. This time, however, he dealt more sensitively with the medium of his creation, the crude spiritual material, which he objectified from his own hidden depth, for the formation of his new creature was molded to his still tentative purpose, with more sympathetic intelligence, with more respect for its nature and its potentiality, though with detachment from its more extravagant demands. To speak thus of the universal creative spirit is almost childishly anthropomorphic, for the life of such a spirit, if it exists at all, must be utterly different from human mentality and utterly inconceivable to man. Nevertheless, since this childish symbolism did force itself upon me, I record it. In spite of its crudity, perhaps it does contain some genuine reflection of the truth, however distorted. In the new creation there occurred a strange kind of discrepancy between the Star Maker's own time and the time proper to the cosmos itself. Hitherto, though he could detach himself from the cosmical time when the cosmical history had completed itself, and observe all the cosmical ages as present, he could not actually create the later phases of a cosmos before he had created the earlier. In his new creation he had not thus limited. Yes, credits. Exactly. Delicious. Agreed. Thus, although this new cosmos was my own cosmos, I regarded it with a surprising angle of vision. No longer did it appear as a familiar sequence of historical events beginning with the initial physical explosion and advancing to the final death. I saw it now not from within the flux of the cosmical time, but quite otherwise. I watched the fashioning of the cosmos in the time proper to the Star Maker, and the sequence of the Star Maker's creative acts was very different from the sequence of historical events. First he conceived from the depth of his own being a something, neither mind nor matter, but rich in potentiality and in suggestive traits, gleams, hints for his creative imagination. Over this fine substance for a long while he pondered. It was a medium in which the one with the many demanded to be most subtly dependent upon one another, in which all parts and all characters must pervade and be pervaded by all other parts and all other characters, in which each thing must seemingly be but an influence in all other things, and yet the whole must be no other than the sum of all its parts, and each part in all-pervading determination of the whole. It was a cosmical substance in which any individual spirit must be, mysteriously, at once an absolute self and a mere figment of the whole. The most subtle medium the star-maker now rough-hewed into the general form of a cosmos. Thus he fashioned a still indeterminate space-time, as yet quite ungeometricized. There we go. An amorphous physicality with no clear quality or direction, no intricacy of physical laws, a more distinctly conceived vital trend and epic adventure of mentality, and a surprisingly definite climax and crown of spiritual lucidity. This last, though its situation in the cosmical time was for the most part late, was given a certain precision of outline earlier in the sequence of creative work than any other factor in the cosmos. And it seemed to me that this was so because the initial substance itself so clearly exposed its own potentiality for some such spiritual form. Thus it was that the star-maker at first almost neglected the physical minutiae of his work, neglected also the earlier ages of cosmical history, and devoted his skill at first almost entirely to shaping the spiritual climax of the whole creature. Not only he had blocked in unmistakably the most awakened phase of the cosmical spirit, did he trace any of the variegated psychological trends which, in the cosmical time, should leap up to it. Not till he had given outline to the incredibly diverse themes of mental growth did he give attention fully to constructing the biological evolutions and the physical and geometrical intricacies which could best evoke the more subtle potentialities of his still rough-hewn cosmical spirit. But as he geometrized, I keep wanting to add other syllables to that, but as he geometrized, he also intermittently turned again to modify and elucidate the spiritual climax itself. Not till the physical and geometrical form of the cosmos was almost completely fashioned could he endow the spiritual climax with fully concrete individuality, while he was still working upon the detail of the countless, poignant, individual lives, upon the fortunes of men, of ichthyoids, of nautiloids, and the rest. I became convinced that his attitude to his creatures was very different from what it had been for other cosmos. For he was neither cold to them, nor yet simply in love with them. In love with them, indeed, he still was, but he had seemingly outgrown all desire to save them from the consequences of their finitude and from the cruel impact of the environment. He loved them without pity, for he saw that their distinctive virtue lay in their finitude, their minute particularity, their tortured balance between dullness and lucidity, and that to save them from these would be to annihilate them. When he had given the last touches to the cosmical ages from the supreme moment back to the initial explosion and on to the final death, the star-maker contemplated his work, and he saw that it was good. As he lovingly, though critically, reviewed our cosmos in all its infinite diversity and in its brief moment of lucidity, I felt that he was suddenly filled with reverence for the creature that he had made, or that he had ushered out of his own secret depth by a kind of divine self-midwifery. He knew that this creature, though imperfect, though a mere creature, a mere figment of his own creative power, was yet in a manner more real than himself. For beside this concrete splendor, what was he but a mere abstract potency of creation? Moreover, in another respect, the thing that he had made was his superior and his teacher. For as he contemplated this with this the loveliest and subtlest of all his works with exultation, even with awe, its impact upon him changed him, clarifying and deepening his will. As he discriminated its virtue and its weakness, his own perception and his own skill matured, so at least it seemed to my bewildered, awe-stricken mind. Thus, little by little, it came about, as so often before, that the Star-Maker outgrew his creature. Increasingly he frowned upon the loveliness that he still cherished. Then, seemingly with a conflict of reverence and impatience, he set our cosmos in its place among his other works. Once more he sank into deep meditation. Once more the creative urge possessed him. Of the many creations which followed, I must perforce say almost nothing, for in most respects they lay beyond my mental reach. I could not have any cognizance of them save in so far as they contained, also with much that was inconceivable, some features that were but fantastic embodiments of principles which I had already encountered. Thus, all their most vital novelty escaped me. I can, indeed, say of all these creations that, like our own cosmos, they were immensely capacious, immensely subtle, and that, in some alien manner or other, every one of them had both a physical and a mental aspect, though in many the physical, however crucial to the spirit's growth, was more transparent, more patently phantasmal than in our own cosmos. In some cases this was true equally of the mental, for the beings were often less deceived by the opacity of their individual mental processes, and more sensitive to their underlying unity. I can say, too, that in all these creations the goal which, as it seemed to me, the Star-Maker sought to realize was richness, delicacy, depth, and harmoniousness of being. But what these words in detail mean I should find it hard to say. It seemed to me that in some cases, as in our own cosmos, he pursued this end by means of an evolutionary process, crowned by an awakened cosmical mind, which strove to gather into its own awareness the whole wealth of cosmical existence, and by creative action to increase it. But in many cases, this goal was achieved with incomparably greater economy of effort and suffering on the part of the creatures, and without the huge dead loss of utterly wasted, ineffective lives which is to us so heartrending. Yet in other creations suffering seemed at least as grave and widespread as in our own cosmos. In his maturity, the Star-Maker conceived many strange forms of time. For instance, some of the latter creations were designed with 2 or more temporal dimensions, and the lives of the creatures were temporal sequences in one or other dimension of the temporal area or volume. These beings experienced their cosmos in a very odd manner. Living for a brief period along one dimension, each perceived at every moment of its life a simultaneous. Oh no. Okay, we're back. I don't know what that was. Okay, so the little like computer noise that happened, I don't know if you heard it, but my computer made a noise and a little like thing popped up and it said like unable to recognize USB. And I was like, well, that's weird. I didn't plug anything in new, so I just ignored it. But apparently it just hated my microphone. You hear the boops, okay. It just hated my microphone for a minute. That's cool. Excellent. Okay, let's see. Where did I hear the first boop? Restart the entire book. Just. Okay, here we are. In some cases, a creature had an active life in every temporal dimension of the cosmos. The divine skill which arranged the whole temporal volume in such a manner that all infinite spontaneous acts of all the creatures should fit together to produce a coherent system of transverse evolutions, far surpassed even the ingenuity of the earlier experiment in pre-established harmony. In other creations, a creature was given only one life, but this was a zigzag line, alternating from one temporal dimension to another according to the quality of the choices that the creature made. Strong or moral choices led in one temporal direction, weak or immoral choices in another. In one inconceivably complex cosmos, whenever a creature was faced with several possible courses of action, it took them all, thereby creating many distinct temporal dimensions and distinct histories of the cosmos. Since in every evolutionary sequence of the cosmos there were very many creatures, and each was constantly faced with many possible courses, and the combination of all their courses were innumerable, an infinity of distinct universes exfoliated from every moment of every temporal sequence in this cosmos. In some creations, each being had sensory perception of the whole physical cosmos from many spatial points of view, or even from every possible point of view. In the latter case, of course, the perception of every mind was identical in spatial range, but it varied from mind to mind in respect of penetration or insight. This depended on the mental caliber and disposition of particular minds. Sometimes these beings had not only omnipresent perception, but omnipresent volition. They could take action in every region of space, though with varying precision and vigor according to their mental caliber. In a manner, they were disembodied spirits, striving over the physical cosmos, like chess players, or like Greek gods over the Trojan plain. In other creations, though there was indeed a physical aspect, there was nothing corresponding to the familiar systematic physical universe. The physical experience of the beings was wholly determined by their mutual impact on one another. Each flooded its fellows with sensory images, the quality and sequence of which were determined according to psychological laws of the impact of mind on mind. In other creations, the processes of perception, memory, intellection, and even desire and feeling were so different from ours as to constitute, in fact, a mentality of an entirely different order. Of these minds, though I seemed to catch remote echoes of them, I cannot say anything. Or rather, though I cannot speak of the alien, psychical modes of these beings, one very striking fact about them I can record. However incomprehensible, their basic mental fibers and the patterns into which these were woven, in one respect, all these beings came fleetingly within my comprehension. However foreign to me their lives, in one respect they were my kin. For all these cosmical creatures, senior to me and more richly endowed, constantly faced existence in the manner that I myself still haltingly strove to learn. Even in pain and grief, even in the very act of moral striving and of white-hot pity, they met fate's issue with joy. Perhaps the most surprising and heartening fact that emerged from all my cosmical and hypercosmical experience was this kinship and mutual intelligibility of the most alien beings in respect of the pure spiritual experience. But I was soon to discover that in this connection I had still much to learn. That's the end of part 2. Okay, so in this one we have the creation of our world. Mix of good and evil. And then also, there was a part where the Star Maker just got tired of our world and just stopped working and placed us in our own cosmos and was like, there you go, have at it, enjoy. Part 3. The ultimate cosmos and the eternal spirit. In vain my tortured attention strained to follow the increasingly subtle creations which, according to my dream, the Star Maker conceived. Cosmos after cosmos issued from his fervent imagination, each one with a distinctive spirit infinitely diversified, each in its fullest attainment more awakened than the last, but each one less comprehensible to me. At length, so my dream, my myth declared, the Star Maker created his ultimate and most subtle cosmos, for which all others were but tentative preparations. Of this final creature, I can only say that it embraced within its own organic texture the essence of all its predecessors, and far more besides. It was like the last movement of a symphony, which may embrace, by the significance of its themes, the essence of the earlier movements, and far more besides. This metaphor extravagantly understates the subtlety and complexity of the ultimate cosmos. I was gradually forced to believe that its relation to each earlier cosmos was approximately that of our own cosmos to a human being, nay, to a single physical atom. Every cosmos that I had hitherto observed now turned out to be a single example of a myriadfold class, like a biological species, or the cell of all the atoms of a single element. The internal life of each atomic cosmos had seemingly the same kind of relevance and the same kind of irrelevance. To the life of the ultimate cosmos as the events within a brain cell or in one of its atoms to the life of a human mind. Yet in spite of this huge discrepancy, I seemed to sense throughout the whole dizzying hierarchy of creations a striking identity of spirit. In all, the goal was conceived, in the end, to include community and the lucid and creative mind. I strained my fainting intelligence to capture something of the form of the ultimate cosmos. With mingled admiration and protest, I haltingly glimpsed the final subtleties of world and flesh and spirit, and of the community of those most diverse and individual beings, awakened to full self-knowledge and mutual insight. But as I strove to hear more inwardly into that music of concrete spirits in countless worlds, I caught echoes not merely of joys unspeakable, but of griefs inconsolable. For some of these ultimate beings not only suffered, but suffered in darkness. Though gifted with full power of insight, their power was barren. The vision was withheld from them. They suffered as lesser spirits would never suffer. Such intensity of harsh experience was intolerable to me. The frail spirit of a lowly cosmos. In an agony of horror and pity, I despairingly stopped the ears of my mind. In my littleness, I cried out against the Maker that no glory of the eternal and absolute could redeem such agony in the creatures. Even if the misery that I had glimpsed was, in fact, but a few dark strands woven into the golden tapestry to enrich it, and all the rest was bliss. Yet such desolation of awakened spirits, I cried, ought not, ought never to be. But what diabolical malice, I demanded, were these glorious beings not merely tortured, but deprived of the supreme consolation, the ecstasy of contemplation and praise which is the birthright of all fully awakened spirits? There had been a time when I myself, as the communal mind of a lowly cosmos, had looked upon the frustration and sorrow of my little members with equanimity, conscious that the suffering of these drowsy beings was no great price to pay for the lucidity that I myself contributed to reality. But the suffering individuals within the ultimate cosmos, though in comparison with the hosts of happy creatures they were few, were beings, it seemed to me, of my own cosmical mental stature, not the frail, shadowy existence that had contributed their dull griefs to my making, and this I could not endure. Yet obscurely I saw that the ultimate cosmos was nevertheless lovely and perfectly formed, and that every frustration and agony within it, however cruel to the sufferer, issued finally, without any miscarriage, in the enhanced lucidity of the cosmical spirit itself. In this sense, at least, no individual tragedy was vain. But this was nothing. And now, as through tears of compassion and hot protest, I seemed to sense the spirit of the ultimate and perfected cosmos face her Maker. In her, it seemed, compassion and indignation were subdued by praise. And the Star Maker, that dark power and lucid intelligence, found in the concrete loveliness of his creature the fulfillment of desire. And in the mutual joy of the Star Maker and the ultimate cosmos was conceived, most strangely, the absolute spirit itself, in which all times are present and all being is comprised. For the spirit which was the issue of this union confronted my reeling intelligence as being at once the ground and the issue of all temporal and finite things. But to me this mystical and remote perfection was nothing. In pity of the ultimate tortured beings, in human shame and rage, I scorned my birthright of ecstasy in that inhuman perfection, and yearned back to my lowly cosmos, to my own human and floundering world, there to stand shoulder to shoulder with my own half-animal kind against the powers of darkness. Yes, and against the indifferent and ruthless, the invincible tyrant whose mere thoughts was sentient and tortured worlds. Then, in the very act of this defiant gesture, I slammed and bolted the door of the little dark cell of my separate self. My walls were all shattered and crushed inward by the pressure of irresistible light, and my naked vision was once more seared by lucidity beyond its endurance. Once more? No. I had but reverted in my interpretive dream to the identical moment of illumination closed by blindness, when I had seemed to spread wing to meet the Star Maker, and was struck down by terrible light. But now I conceived more clearly what it was that had overwhelmed me. I was indeed confronted by the Star Maker, but the Star Maker was now revealed as more than the creative and therefore finite spirit. He now appeared as the eternal and perfect spirit which comprises all things and all times, and contemplates timelessly the infinitely diverse host which it comprises. The illumination which flooded in on me and struck me down to blind worship was a glimmer, so it seemed to me, of the eternal spirit's own all-penetrating experience. It was with anguish and horror, and yet with acquiescence, even with praise, that I felt or seemed to feel something of the eternal spirit's temper as it apprehended in one intuitive and timeless vision all our lives. Here was no pity, no proffer of salvation, no kindly aid. Or here were all pity and all love, but mastered by a frosty ecstasy. Our broken lives, our loves, our follies, our betrayals, our forlorn and gallant defenses were one and all calmly anatomized, assessed, and placed. True, they were one and all lived through with complete understanding, with insight and full sympathy, even with passion. But sympathy was not ultimate in the temper of the eternal spirit. Contemplation was. Love was not absolute. Contemplation was. And though there was love, there was also hate comprised within the spirit's temper, for there was cruel delight in the contemplation of every horror and glee in the downfall of the virtuous. All passions, it seemed, were comprised within the spirit's temper, but mastered, icily gripped within the cold, clear, crystal ecstasy of contemplation. That this should be the upshot of all our lives, this artist's keen appraisal, and yet I worshipped. But this was not the worst, for in saying that the spirit's temper was contemplation, I imputed to it a finite human experience and an emotion, thereby comforting myself, even though with cold comfort. But in truth the eternal spirit was ineffable. Nothing whatever could be truly said about it. Even to name it spirit was perhaps to say more than was justified. Yet to deny it that name would be no less mistaken. For whatever it was more, not less than spirit. More, not less than any possible human meaning of that word. And from the human level, even from the level of a cosmical mind, this more, obscurely and agonizingly glimpsed, was a dread misery compelling adoration. End of chapter 15. We are on our last chapter. Oof. I'm resituating. We are on our last chapter. I'm so excited. Okay, so within that last chapter, it seems like even it's a shorter one too. Less than 20 minutes. It seems like even the best, grandest cosmos, there are issues with it. And it's hard to put to words because our small little human brains and our small little human minds cannot fathom the reaches of this. All right, last one. Chapter 16. Epilogue. Back to Earth. I woke on the hill. The street lamps of our suburb outshone the stars. The reverberation of the clock's stroke was followed by 11 strokes more. I singled out our window. A surge of joy, of wild joy, swept me like a wave. Then peace. The littleness, but the intensity of earthly events, gone. Abolished in an instant was the hypercosmical reality, the wild fountain of creation, and all the spray of worlds vanished, transmuted into fantasy and into sublime irrelevance. The littleness, but the intensity of this whole grain of rock, with its film of ocean and of air, and its discontinuous variegated, tremulous film of life, of the shadowy hills, of the sea, vague, horizonless, of the pulsating Cepheid lighthouse, of the clanking railway trucks. My hand caressed the pleasant harshness of the heather. Vanished the hypercosmical apparition. Not such as I had dreamed must the real be, but infinitely more subtle, more dread, more excellent, and infinitely nearer home. Yet, however false the vision in detail of structure, even perhaps in its whole form, in temper surely it was relevant. In temper, perhaps, it was even true. The real itself, surely, had impelled me to conceive that image, false in every theme and facet, yet in spirit true. The stars wanly trembled above the street lamps, great suns, or feeble sparks of the night sky. Suns, it was vaguely rumored, lights at least to steer by, and to beckon the mind from the terrestrial flurry, but piercing the heart with their cold spears. Sitting there on the heather, on our planetary grain, I shrank from the abysses that opened up on every side and in the future. The silent darkness, the featureless unknown, were more dread than all the terrors that imagination had mustered. Peering, the mind could see nothing sure, nothing in all human experience to be grasped as certain, except uncertainty itself. Nothing but obscurity gendered by a thick haze of theories. Man's science was a mere mist of numbers, his philosophy but a fog of words. His very perception of this rocky grain and all its wonders was but a shifting and a lying apparition. Even oneself, that seeming central fact, was a mere phantom, so deceptive that the most honest of men must question his own honesty, so insubstantial that he must even doubt his very existence and our loyalties, so self-deceiving, so misinformed and misconceived, so savagely pursued and hate-warped. Our very loves, and these in full and generous intimacy, must be condemned as unseeing, self-regarding, and self-gratulatory. And yet, I singled out our window. We had been happy together. We had found, or we had created, our little treasure of community. This was the one rock in all the welter of experience. This, not the astronomical and hypercosmical immensity, nor even the planetary grain. This alone was the solid ground of existence. On every side was confusion, a rising storm, great waves already drenching our rock, and all around in the dark welter, faces and appealing hands, half seen and vanishing. In the future, black with the rising storm of this world's madness, though shot through with flashes of a new and violent hope, the hope of a sane, a reasonable, a happier world. Between our time and that future, what horror lay in store? Oppressors would not meekly give way, and we, too, accustomed only to security and mildness, were fit only for a kindly world, wherein none being tormented, none turns desperate. We were adapted only to fair weather, for the practice of the friendly, but not too difficult, not heroical virtues, in a society both secure and just. Instead, we found ourselves in an age of titanic conflict, when the relentless powers of darkness and the ruthless, because desperate powers of light were coming to grips for a death struggle in the world's torn heart, when grave choices must be made in crisis after crisis, and no simple or familiar principles were adequate. Beyond our estuary, a red growth of fire sprang from a foundry. A hand, the dark forms of the gorse lent mystery to the suburb's foot-worn moor. In imagination I saw, behind our own hill's top, the further and unseen hills. I saw the plains and woods and all the fields, each with its myriads of particular blades. I saw the whole land curving down from me over the planet's shoulder. The villages were strung together on a mesh of roads, steel lines, and humming wires, mist drops on a cobweb. Here and there a town displayed itself as an expanse of light, a nebulous luminosity sprinkled with stars. Beyond the plains, London, neon-lit, seething, was a microscope slide drawn from foul water and crowned with nosing animalcules. Animalcules! In the star's view, no doubt, these creatures were mere vermin, yet each to itself, and sometimes one to another, was more real than all the stars. Gazing beyond London, imagination detected the dim stretch of the Channel, and then the whole of Europe, a patchwork of tillage and sleeping industrialism. Beyond poplared Normandy spread Paris, with the towers of Notre Dame tipped slightly by reason of Earth's curvature. Further on, the Spanish night was ablaze with the murder of cities. Away to the left lay Germany, with its forests and factories, its music, its steel helmets. In cathedral squares I seemed to see the young men ranked together in thousands, exalted, possessed, saluting the floodlit Führer. In Italy, too, land of memories and illusions, the mobs idle, spellbound, the young. Far leftwards again, Russia, an appreciably convex segment of our globe, snow-pale in the darkness, spread out under the stars and cloud tracks. Inevitably, I saw the spires of the Kremlin confronting the Red Square. There, Lenin lay victorious. Far off at the foot of the Urals, imagination detected the ruddy plumes and smoke pall of Magnitostroy. Beyond the hills there gleamed a hint of dawn, for day, at my midnight, was already pouring westward across Asia, overtaking with its advancing front of gold and rose the tiny smoke caterpillar of the Trans-Siberian Express. To the north, the iron-hard Arctic oppressed the exiles in their camps. Far southward lay the rich valleys and plains that once cradled our species. But there I now saw railway lines ruled across the snow. In every village Asiatic children were waking to another school day and to the sound of Lenin. South again, the Himalayas, snow-clad from waist to crest, looked over the rabble of their foothills into crowded India. I saw the dancing cotton plants and the wheat and the sacred river that bore the waters of the Comet past rice fields and crocodile shallows, past Calcutta with its shipping and its offices down to the sea. From my midnight I looked into China. The morning sun glanced from the flooded fields and gilded the ancestral graves. The Yang Sea, a gleaming, crumpled thread, rushed through its gorge. Beyond the Korean ranges and across the sea, the Fujiyama, extinct and formal. Around it, a volcanic population welled and seethed in that narrow land like lava in a crater. Already it spilled over Asia a flood of armies and of trade. Imagination withdrew and turned to Africa. I saw the man-made thread of water that joins west to east, then minarets, pyramids, the ever-waiting Sphinx. Ancient Memphis itself now echoed with the rumor of Magnitostroy. Far southward, men slept beside great lakes. Elephants trampled the crops. Further still, where Dutch and English profit by the trade of humans. Millions. Those hosts were stirred by vague dreams of freedom. Peering beyond the whole bulge of Africa, beyond cloud-spread Table Mountain, I saw the Southern Ocean, black with storms, and then the ice cliffs, and their seals and penguins, and the high snowfields of the one unpeopled continent. Imagination faced the midnight sun, crossed the pole, and passed Erebus, vomiting hot lava down its ermine. Northward it sped over the summer sea, past New Zealand, that freer but less conscious Britain, to Australia, where clear-eyed horsemen collect their flocks. Still peering eastward from my hill, I saw the Pacific, strewn with islands, and then the Americas, where the descendants of Europe long ago mastered the descendants of Asia, through priority in the use of guns and the arrogance that guns breed. Beside the further ocean, north and south, lay the old New River, the River Plate and Rio, the New England cities, radiating center of the old new style of life and thought. New York, dark against the afternoon sun, was a cluster of tall crystals, a Stonehenge of modern megaliths. Round these, like fishes nibbling at the feet of waiters, the great liners crowded. Out at sea also I saw them, and the plunging freighters forging through the sunset, portholes and decks aglow. Stokers sweated at furnaces. Lookout men in crow's nests shivered. Dance music, issuing from opened doors, was drowned by the wind. The whole planet, the whole rock grain with its busy swarms, I now saw as an arena where two cosmical antagonists, two spirits, were already preparing for a critical struggle, already assuming terrestrial and local guise, and coming to grips in our half-awakened minds. In city upon city, in village after village, and in innumerable lonely farmsteads, cottages, hovels, shacks, huts, and all the crevices where human creatures were intent on their little comforts and triumphs and escapes, the great struggle of our age was brewing. One antagonist appeared as the will to dare for the sake of the new, the longed for, the reasonable, and joyful world in which every man and woman may have scope to live fully and live in service of mankind. The other seemed essentially the myopic fear of the unknown. Or was it more sinister? Was it the cunning will for private mastery, which fomented for its own ends the archaic, reason-hating, and vindictive passion of the tribe? It seemed that in the coming storm of the dearest things must be destroyed. All private happiness, all loving, all creative work in art, science, and philosophy, all intellectual scrutiny and speculative imagination, all creative social building, all, indeed, that man should normally live for, seemed folly and mockery and mere self-indulgence in the presence of public calamity. But if we failed to preserve them, when would they live again? How to face such an age? How to muster courage, being capable only of homely virtues? How to do this, yet preserve the mind's integrity, never to let the struggle destroy in one's own heart what one tried to serve in the world, the spirit's integrity? Two lights for guidance. The first, our little glowing atom of community, with all that it gratifies. The second, the cold light of the stars, symbol of the hypercosmical reality with its crystal ecstasy. Strange that in this light, it would even in the dearest love is frostily assessed, and even in the possible defeat of our half-waking world is contemplated without a remission of praise. The human crisis does not lose, but gains significance. Strange that it seems more, not less, urgent to play some part in this struggle, this brief effort of animalcules striving to win for their race some increase of lucidity before the ultimate darkness. And that is the end of the book. We did it. So I kind of loved the ending. Mission accomplished us. Yeah, I kind of loved the ending. The epilogue was doing it for me. It really was. I love that he woke up because remember that's how we started was him falling asleep on the hill. I love that we woke up and was like, holy crap. Yes, I traveled to all of these worlds, but right here, right now, I can pinpoint very specific things that are both right and amazing and great, but also terrifying and horrible and evil. And that's just really cool. Like, what a way to bring it full circle and bring it back and make it even more obvious that the other worlds were actually just pinpoints of what was happening on Earth. I say that like it was past. Remember, this book was written in 1937. So cool. Soaking vibes, that's all. That's all. That's good. But yes, we have finished. We did it. That's gonna be it for to me. For to me. See, every time I am unable to say that. Thank you so much for the recommendation. You could have given up like second or third other humans. There was a lot of other humans. Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah, thank you so much for the suggestion. This was a fun one. It was a weird one. It was a good one. It was very vibey, for sure, for sure. I don't know what we're gonna read next. I just don't know. You like the start when we were zooming around the solar system. Yeah, yeah, that was really cool. And then I do think that we sort of did, like you said, like we got lost in so many different worlds. I feel like some of them could have been cut out. You know what I mean? You know what I mean? The plot was structure. Yeah, it did seem very meandering for sure. Yeah. And then I think maybe that's why I liked the ending so much was that it was like, hey, you made it through all of the weird, not really plot, mostly commentary book. I'm gonna make it real succinct, and this is what's gonna happen. You had a dozen cool thoughts. Yeah, that's what I think. Yeah. And I mean, he sort of gets away with it by saying that like he fell asleep at the beginning. So like much like a dream, like you're not like story. I don't know. I don't know. But yeah, I do feel like he did have a lot of thoughts and he's like, what if space? And then tried to fit all of those thoughts into space. For sure. But the writing itself, like the vocabulary used and like the sentence structure and everything like that, like I really enjoyed. There were a couple times, like a couple descriptions that I felt were just like awesome. Like I love that like there would be like a star maker thinking that all humans or all creatures are just vermin and that they're like destroying everything. Like, that's a fun concept to think about. So, yes. I don't know what we're gonna read next. I'll figure it out. Um, and yeah, we'll figure out another book. It'll be great. It'll be grand. But that's it for me today. There we go. I said it. I said it first try. Thank you all so much for being here. I will see you very soon. As always, whether you lurk, whether you chat, I 1000% appreciate you and I 1000% appreciate your support. If I do not see you next time, I hope to see you even sooner. Bye.